Okay. So, hi. Today I will be talking about political violence. There has been much to do of over the last few years about the efficacy or morality of violence in protests, violence in riots, if you will, and violence in political activism in general. Many people have pointed to the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement had riots and things like that, and this was, they will quote MLK, riots are the voice of the unheard. Therefore, we shouldn't be telling people how to protest whose rights are being stripped from them or rights are being taken away from them. I am sympathetic to that. However, I believe that if we want to see serious change, then the data suggests, and intuitively we can figure this out, that nonviolent civil resistance is the path forward. I am not here to argue that violence never works or is never necessary. That's not my argument. My argument is simply that civil resistance is more effective both in democracies and in authoritarian governments and has been since post World War II. I think that this is a clear situation where if you want to get change done and accomplished, the best way to do that is through nonviolent means. And I would contrast that with peaceful means because nonviolence does not mean peaceful. Nonviolent civil resistance does create conflict. It does put pressure on various actors and institutions.
Coming up.
Is my 2 minutes up?
Just about, yeah.
Okay, I'll just end it at this. So again, if we're serious about wanting to help people achieve political change, nonviolence is what we should advocate for.
Okay. And rolling to the other team.
I guess I'll just start right now. Thank you, first of all, Vaush, for agreeing to host this. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
So I take the question with which tonight's debate is concerned to be twofold: whether nonviolent or violent resistance is more politically efficacious, and whether the use of violence is permissible ethically. The very terms in which both questions are given are highly problematic and indeed heavily problematized by the literature on political resistance, which, due to the ambiguity inherent in this word violence, is recently moving away from framing such questions in terms of a violence-nonviolence dichotomy, and is rather concerned with differences of outcome between armed and unarmed political resistance. Given such ambiguities, the claim my side has to defend is comparatively modest and easily defended. Whether or not the disciplined avoidance of violence has been efficacious in some case or other, the classic examples being the Satyagraha movement of Gandhi and the civil rights movement, these are not sufficient to take violence off the table in all or even most cases. For instance, although studies often find that violent resistance can hinder the success of nonviolent movements, leaving aside the ambiguity and inconsistency with which the term violence is treated, this conclusion is frequently arrived at by collapsing the aims of violent fringes, quote-unquote, with that of the larger mainstream movement, potentially erasing the identities and goals of what are in fact distinct movements in themselves. Further, if we consider the success of such movements as those of MLK and Gandhi to be worth the human cost of even some deliberate violence to attain, dogmatically taking violence off the table in all cases would be both anti-pragmatic and unethical. This becomes more obvious when one considers the prior or adjacent violence, which also contributes to political outcomes alongside nonviolent movements, for example, that of the Indian National Army, which made the continued domination of India seem increasingly costly and untenable. In short, while nonviolence is of course always desirable, no sane person would advocate on behalf of violence for its own sake. Violence cannot be written off either strategically or ethically without also deciding that the cause of any movement that cannot prevail without violence is de facto forfeit due to an implicit preference for state power. State power, of course, being enforced by definition with violence. Thank you.
All right, and rolling back to the other side, Loner Box or Professor Me, who would prefer?
I'll go.
All right.
I think one obvious thing is that everyone from any political persuasion does support violence in some form, right? It just depends on where and when and in what context. For example, I think there's always this impression that people give of liberals as being very averse to violence and more pursuing like civility politics and nonviolence, but that's not even entirely true. If you look at the Ukraine war, liberals they're a united front on arming the fuck out of Ukraine and pushing Russians all the way out. Whereas if you ask people on the left, who you would normally expect to be more violent, on that issue, they're like, it's a coin flip of whether or not they're okay with that or if they want to get Ukraine to cede land in exchange for peace. So it depends on where and when. I think because of what happened on Twitter a few weeks ago, I was looking at I looked at the whole essay of MLK's letter from Birmingham jail. There's one bit in there that I think is really surprising, not the white moderate bit, but the part where he talks about how he himself, he's rejecting the claim that he's an extremist because he talks about how he himself feels like he has to be a moderating voice between complacency on one end of the black community and violence on the other, being the Nation of Islam and black nationalists. And he even says that he's really like concerned that if the black nationalist movement grows, then America would descend into a racial nightmare, is what he says. And if you look at MLK's activism, it's like he was incredibly strict and like very, very nuanced in his political tactics. He even after they would first exhaust all negotiations with legislators in their particular states that they were going for, and then after that, if that failed, they would go through what was called self-purification, where they would drill people down on the ethics of nonviolence, the morality of it, the pragmatism of it. They would collect knives and weapons from protesters before marches to make sure that no one lashed out. And if you look at that, those 10 years from 1955 to 65, they achieved more in that period than in the 100 years before that. And all those groups, NAACP, SNCC, CORE, SCLC, they all did it by adhering to nonviolence. So, yeah.
Okay. And as we are rolling back around, Doe or Sirius, your preference? Sunday, we're getting some noise from your mic.
Oh, are you?
Yes.
Is it me?
I believe it was Sunday's mic, or maybe it wasn't. Well, whatever the case. Doe or Sirius, whoever prefer.
All right, I'm next up. All right.
Okay.
So, when debating the question of nonviolent resistance, its proponents tacitly assume the role of event organizer, where they're in full control of the tactics used by a social movement. They tend to think in terms of efficiency, a logic of getting the most out of every movement action. However, this sort of thinking tends to miss the organic and unplanned nature of violent action. Whether we like it or not, violence will always be a part of every social movement. The question, then, should be how we think and talk about violence amongst ourselves and to the public. While scholars are often split on the outcomes of violent action, finding differential positive and negative effects depending on the study or classification of violence, one thing they tend to agree on is the fact that what people perceive as violent is highly dependent on the nature of the protest movement and the way it's framed by those who talk about it. Studies consistently find that the framing of a protest event as violent will lessen support for the cause it represents, regardless of the actual nature of the protest. The same event can engender either positive or negative attitudes depending on if it's contextualized as violent. Moreover, scholars consistently find that the perception of nonviolence is dependent on the composition of the protest movement. In the American context, racial minorities are the prime example. Protests comprised mostly of racial minorities are more likely to be seen as violent, even when people are assured that the protests were peaceful. All this is to say that as members of a given social movement, the question of tactical efficacy is almost irrelevant. Tactics emerge outside of any single person's control. In the event of such violence, then, our energy should not be put towards policing our own, but towards seizing and reframing the narrative. Once you've allowed your opposition, those with all the power, to set the terms of engagement, you've lost. It is neither just nor efficient to allow oppressors to dictate the terms of oppression.
Okay, thank you. Up next, Professor Meek.
What's up, y'all? So doesn't seem like the efficacy of violent protest is taken too seriously in academia, which, to be fair, is some of the criticisms of previous research that was in the sort of steel-manning papers of the position that I was able to find. What little evidence I could find has a variety of like pretty major flaws that makes it mostly irrelevant as far as I can tell at best. And even then, even taking that out of the equation, doesn't really support. Even if I disregard that, the evidence that I can find doesn't really support the conclusion. As far as I can tell, it's one of the most fundamental like building blocks of society. This idea that like one of the most fundamental appeals of a society, of a civilization, is the idea that you are free from the fear of people coming along and saying, we're going to fuck your shit up if you don't give us what we want. That's a little crude way of saying it, but I don't really, I think that people don't want to live in that world, whether or not they even realize it. I think we tend to intellectualize this issue in a way that sort of makes this out of touch, because I don't really, when I imagine people in the population, I don't really see these people that would be moved by violent protest. I don't really see, even the most fearful among us are more likely to go save me daddy government than to say, we'll give these people what they want so that we're going to stop. And even if you're going to argue that violence gets attention to your cause, I don't really see that as a justification for violence, even if it's true in practice, because it seems more like a justification for laziness. Because all that tells to me when I hear that is that it doesn't seem to me there to be any reason to believe that violence is the only way to gain attention to your cause. So it seems to me that even if that's a justification, not to put words in anyone's mouth, that's merely a reason that movements ought to be, that otherwise might be violent, ought to be more creative. Any countercultural phenomenon has a natural burden put on it beyond reproach if it wishes to best succeed. If you're trying to dissolve or overthrow an authority or a government, then obviously, like in the case of an actual revolution, violence makes sense. But outside those bounds, I don't think violence is sort of antithetical to sensible protest, as far as I can tell.
Okay, thank you. And now finally, Doe.
Proponents of nonviolence are almost universally not proponents of nonviolence. They are instead majority-minded people who see democracy itself as a greater goal than the plight of any oppressed minority peoples. Martyrdom is the nonviolence dogmatist's path towards justice, especially martyrdom of others. Oppressed peoples are made to play the role of martyr, submit to oppression publicly until the majority's mind is changed. Justice is made when the majority changes its legal structures. Liberal theorists on civil disobedience tell us how much more important it is that the authority structures of the majority are not threatened than the suffering of oppressed peoples defending themselves. Oppressed peoples should be more thoughtful about the sensibilities of the majority, they say, or else is implied. This is not a politics of nonviolence. This is a politics of our violence. The most obvious place to see this at play is in the research done into nonviolent resistance. Despite whatever other problems that arise in trying to delineate violence from nonviolence, damage to property is treated as violence consistently throughout these studies, leaving the construction of property completely out of the frame. The construction of a world by those in seats of power, like strapping murderous highways across every nation, forcing the majority of people to become reliant on cars, machines which poison the air and slaughter 3,700 people and over 1 million vertebrate animals a day, are treated as nonviolent, completely neutral acts. This is the false thesis. We do not see the sensibilities of the majority as a worthy metric for justice, and as such, our allegiance cannot be to nonviolence, legalist structures, or any other political technology deployed to privilege some over others. Our allegiance remains to justice, and it is not just to dogmatically let the innocent get abused.
I would, I guess we're doing opens now. We can just kind of go with it.
Yeah.
Very
Wait,
quickly
can I go
before you
before
go
you?
with,
Really
hang
quick.
on, I've got one for Vaush.
Well, I've got one.
No, but
from
it's a technical issue. Professor
technical
Mead is
thing.
very
Okay, technical. Right, go ahead.
yes. Professor Mead is very quiet. Is there any way you can boost your volume?
Yeah.
That is technical. As for everyone talking, 3v3 is a lot of people. Try not to shout over each other too much. If necessary, then we'll start doing turns. But ideally, you could go back and forth without that being necessary. Go on ahead.
I'll just real quick, like the idea of justice. I want to touch on that. So there are two things that were said that I want to touch on briefly. The first is Sirius. I'll go in the order. Sirius mentioned that a lot of the problems with violence is it happens organically. It's not organized. It just kind of happens. You can't really control it. I think that's one of the main issues with violence and violent protests, and is because we know that organization wins in these cases. The more organized, the more tactical, the more coherent a group or a advocacy, minority or whatever is, the more likely they are to succeed. And what violence is a poor tool of communication. No one really knows what you're trying to say. All they're seeing is the big explosions or the bloody noses. And this is why, again, while it might not be just that people have to suffer, it's reality. And so this is how the world works.
Okay, so then what should we do when violence inevitably happens in a protest movement? What should we do about it?
Condemn it vociferously.
Why?
Yeah, why? That seems like a waste of our resources. Like, are we going to go out on the streets and protest the protesters? It seems like our resources are better spent reframing the narrative so that people don't see it see it as violent.
Typically, the leaders would just, when they've got the next chances, they would say they condemn the riots. I mean, even language of the unheard, in that speech, he condemns violence. Like, it's not like you have to make a new protest against it, right?
You are presuming, though, the presence of an extremely charismatic and influential individual who's capable of actually rallying an entire protest around a single program. When you're not in that kind of situation, it seems to me that you do, in fact, end up simply protesting the protest again, undercutting the momentum of whatever they both have in common.
If you're talking civil rights, that's not entirely the case, because it wasn't just MLK and the SCLC, right? It was also the NAACP, it was the SNCC, it was CORE, it was most of them, right? It was most of these organizations. Some of them did flip towards like a self-defense approach, which is more nuanced, but yeah, they were mostly nonviolent.
Well, you clearly have a much more nuanced, you clearly have a much more developed understanding of the details of that case than I do. But be that as it may, nonetheless, in the absence of these, you still find yourself in that situation. If you don't have organizations with the legitimacy and the sort of unitary pull to kind of adhere a multifaceted, widespread group to a single program of action, discipline and nonviolence becomes impossible. And so as a consequence of this, when violence inevitably occurs, if you actually allocate all of your resources towards protesting that, you've undercut the momentum of your movement. There's no way around that.
I think,
well, even if we were to accept theoretically, right, this idea that like, which I mean, I think is sort of inevitably true. Like even for my side's belief system, if we were to say that, well, let's just convince everyone that they weren't actually violent. Well, sure, I'm sure that would, even according to our worldview, of course, that would increase support for it. But doesn't that seems to me that, regardless of whether or not it's the case, it seems to me that is simply another reason why more peaceful protests would be better. I'm not saying you have to devote all of your resources to it.
There's a flip side to this that you're very quickly, and then I'll let you go. There's a flip side to this that you're not considering, and that's that even in the event of quote unquote nonviolent protests and the studies that you could refer to in order to determine whether or not nonviolent versus violent quote unquote protests are more efficacious, oftentimes what constitutes a violent or a nonviolent protest is itself radically determined on whether or not, for example, they can people doing the study consider armed versus unarmed to be the distinguishing factor between violent versus nonviolent, or whether, for example, windows being targeted versus persons being targeted indicates violent versus nonviolent. And the bare fact of one or two people out of a crowd of 100,000 smashing a window somewhere can be taken up by the media and used to color a completely peaceful protest, a completely nonviolent protest, as violent nonetheless. And so either way, you still find yourself in the reverse situation, in which a nonviolent protest can be very easily manipulated optically to look like a violent protest, regardless of how disciplined it actually is. And indeed, this did happen with MLK's protests too.
Doesn't that back up?
Didn't MLK make his job easier by being disciplined with his people? Wasn't that why he preached discipline? Like MLK preached and spent so much effort in organizing basically extremely disciplined protesters.
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. He didn't just organize discipline and nonviolence with his protesters. He also orchestrated the protests, and this is one of the reasons why Malcolm X detested MLK. He also orchestrated a situation in which the most innocent of his protesters, including children, would be in direct confrontations with the police and result in an appalling display to horrify the public. So it's
Isn't he just putting something on display that's already happening in that state?
No,
he was creating the conditions for that violence to be put on display. Like that was
for it to be put on display.
No, but that was part of the explicit strategy, was it was a martyrdom strategy where you go out there and you get beat up in order to draw sympathy towards your cause.
It was a martyrdom strategy, but it wasn't passive.
No, you're referencing Project C, where they wanted to fill up, it was Bull Connor in Birmingham, they wanted to fill up his jail with kids. I'm pretty sure King objected to that, but it was adopted anyway. But yeah, you're right. Like they did basically say go and confront very racist and very aggressive cops and just let them hit you. But I think their tactic as well was they would specifically get the more seasoned like veterans of the movement to stand in front so they could absorb the blows. So this whole thing about like throwing kids is maybe a little bit like that was like that. I think that happened once. It was even very controversial within the movement.
So I think we're talking around the issue here, and that is of organization. Yes, if your movement is disorganized and has no central leadership and no central kind of drive, it's less likely to succeed, whether it's violent or not. It just is, right? There are so many benefits to having a coherent community coalesce around a single banner, basically, even if it's multiple groups. this can't be understated. And violence, to be clear, is divisive in that way. It will automatically gatekeep who can participate in the protest. It keeps people out.
I don't think that that's true, Wick, because from what I've read, it seems like violence offers another alternative way of expressing discontent that isn't available to a lot of people. Like, a lot of people don't have the time or energy to join like a disciplined protest movement, but they might have the time to like get off and like go out onto the streets to riot just on one day.
If you aren't strong, if you aren't able to enact violence, and most people aren't. Let's be clear. Kids, elderly, these people generally can't do violence on the same level that I could.
I mean, so long as destruction of property is considered violent, I'm pretty sure each and every one of those can sabotage plenty of things without much effort.
Well, Wick, you seem to have this conception of an effective violent protest. No, hang on. You seem to have this notion of an effective violent protest as being like the 300 Spartans at the front line of a rally in the street. But violent protest incorporates more than just actually going fisticuffs with the cops toe-to-toe, right? So, for example, Gandhi's Satyagraha movement, I can never bloody pronounce that, was itself committed to nonviolence, but it was massively aided by the fact that the Indian National Army was also bombing and assassinating the British during that entire time, making the holding of India seem increasingly unpopular. That aided in the efficacy of Gandhi's movement. Now
you can point to one-offs where that might be true, but I'm talking in general. We're talking about generalities.
No, but the generality is on my side.
Yeah, even in general, like Erica Chenoweth, who is your primary source. Chenoweth. She recently wrote a paper where she said that violent flanks of the movement have mixed effects. That it isn't just straightforwardly about positive or negative, that there's both positive and negative effects to having a violent but unarmed section, which is what riots are. Riots are violent but unarmed.
So the problem here, again, is when we want a movement to succeed, right? Whether it be in an authoritarian regime, such as Balkans or things like that, with the butcher of the Balkans, Milosevic was his name, right? Mm-hmm. Very violent, very repressive regime there. And then we have democracies such as America.
I need to stop humming. It's really distracting.
In both cases, what violence does is it keeps people from participating because so many people are just naturally, instinctually, intuitively disinclined to do violence towards the people around them. That's just the natural state. And so when you see people getting, when you come across a person, you have no context, you don't know what's going on, you see one person beating the shit out of the other, most people's instinct are to defend the person who's being beat up. Whether or not the person deserved getting hit, that doesn't come into play. We don't know. We don't see. So when we talk about framing narratives, you're right that there are certain groups out there who will frame anything as violent, no matter how small, how limited, anything like that. But it does us no service to stand in front of a burning building and preach how things are mostly peaceful. That was a gift to the people against your movement. It was a gift to the people who oppose what you want to see. And we can't let that happen. We just have to call balls and strikes. And if things are violent, we condemn it. And when things aren't, we say, no, you're wrong. But people have to trust us. And right now they don't.
And the thing with BLM, though, you were talking about the idea of having to have like very seasoned protesters to make sure that it stays very like well behaved. But like BLM protesters were not like well trained, but they were mostly peaceful. And also, how many videos did we watch of antagonists within BLM protests trying to instigate violence? Even that weird guy with the fucking black over his head who was smashing those windows, and everyone tried to stop him. Like, that's what they mean. But that's what if I say condemning violence within your movement, that's what I mean, right? Like, just you see it, you stop it, and definitely don't like try to adopt it as a strategy unless you're in like fucking South Africa or something, you know, when it's like when everything else has been exhausted.
So wait, that one guy that people tried to stop, should they physically try to stop him?
Maybe, yeah, or just gather around him, film him.
Force themselves?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on the context. If he's
Depends.
like beating up babies, yeah.
If he's hitting,
stop the
if he's
guy.
maybe smashing up windows, just like film him, catch him doing it, try to identify him for the police. I don't know.
So just to be clear,
Wait, you want to
hang on.
identify protesters?
No, just very quickly. So just to be clear, you guys are entirely in line with protesters engaging in violence, provided it is only targeting people who are identified as other protesters.
What?
That's
So
not
we
true
think
at all.
totally differently about defensive violence versus
that is-
escalating to violence, right?
What it is violence. Like if I forcibly stop somebody from smashing a window, that is violence.
It's
yeah, but we also would-
scale. There's
if people start-
do you not just let me quick serious? Do you not understand the difference between someone hitting someone in the face and someone stopping someone from hitting someone? in the
Wait.
face?
Can I ask?
Oh no! In this case,
Wait.
it would actually be. Oh, actually, Doe, you can go. You can go.
I was gonna say, can you see the difference between like cars murdering 1 million vertebrates every single day and someone, I don't know, what's a number of things you could do? Sabotaging a car plant,
Yes, blowing up a car plant is more violent than a car existing.
I didn't say sabotaging. Hold on, I didn't say blowing up. I didn't say blowing up. I said sabotaging. Sabotage is very, very, very. There's a large range of things you can do, but like, yeah. So murdering animals, just like 3,700 people every day, murdering them is less violent than stopping a car company from producing cars.
Just to come back to the question about the guy smashing windows, I think what was the most common thing to respond to that was basically people just let them know that they were on their own, that they didn't represent the movement. It was showed on camera to show the public that this isn't like what we're for, and then the person fucked off and they would just boo them or something. That was like the most common thing I saw.
Look, that's fair, and I don't think any of us would contend against, for example, a protest maintaining some level of order or standards of conduct within their group. But when we're talking about directing your attention towards condemning protest violence, we're not talking about one or two people, which will exist in every single movement or can be projected to exist in every single movement, regardless of the explicit policy, no matter how carefully it's enforced within the movement. We're talking about other movements that are alongside, looking towards the same ends, that are engaging in different strategies. So, for example, there is one movement that is dogmatically against any kind of physical altercation, even in self-defense. That'd be the MLK strategy. There's another one that's like, well, no, if the cops bash against us, we bash them back, we maintain our bodily integrity, etc., etc. If you direct your resources against that group, you're effectively giving propagandistic fodder to the other group, which can then paint the movement as a whole as intrinsically violent, except for some of the good ones. You see the problem?
So the problem is, at least in the MLK movement, right? If we're going to use a civil, I think that's the one that people go to because they're most familiar with it. But we have data to suggest that even when violence was started by the police and then the people simply fought back, that still ended up being kind of a wash in effectiveness. And people tend to decide with the state. Just that's their bias, right? And we can say that's not fair, that's not just. I agree, but that's generally what happens. And I think most of what we're going to get to here is the other side is saying, well. I can give you a source, right? But it was a study done in very recently, basically, that showed that basically the riots led to the election of the '68 riots specifically.
The civil rights movement isn't a great example simply for the reason that the Civil Rights Act was being tied up for years before Kennedy was assassinated. And then a more savvy politician in Lyndon B. Johnson came in and managed to get it pushed through.
What do you mean it was being tied up? What?
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
I think Kennedy introduced it in the same year he was killed, no?
No, not unless I'm very mistaken.
He took it to Congress in '63, right?
He took it to Congress in '63, but the historical record, I believe, is that Lyndon B. Johnson was actually successful in pushing it through, and that it was being tied up by the Democrats at the time. I'd have to get the particulars though, so I'm going to claim the same thing that Whick just did.
Okay.
Yeah. Either way, I think that what we're going to get to here is a difference in what we want the world to be versus what the world is. I would love to live in a world where yes, people were able to suss out the nuance of violence in an event and like understand that not everyone who is being violent is necessarily in the wrong. But that's not the world we actually live in. The world we actually live in, people abhor violence. They want stability more than anything else. And when you threaten that stability, or you appear to threaten that stability, they are going to largely side against you. So what you need to do is to demonstrate that the people you are going against are the ones that are threatening your stability. And the best way to do that, like it or not, is the martyr strategy. It is to have people beat you up, get shown on TV.
Okay, so sorry to...
That's just what wins.
Sorry to cut off this Braveheart speech, but very quickly. So it seems like what actually happened was Kennedy had this referred to the Rules Committee. Lyndon B. Johnson had this brought before the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the key difference here. So Johnson made a different move than Kennedy did, which resulted in the bill actually being pushed into effect, as opposed to being held up in debate.
And I think also, Lyndon B. Johnson had a massive majority when he ran on civil rights, because by that point, yes, support for civil rights, like I think it was like in the 50s, I think 20% of Americans saw it as the biggest issue in America, but then by Lyndon Johnson, it was like more than half, because of what they were seeing happening in the South. Because of that,
I want to wait really quick.
Yeah.
Okay.
Loner box, really quick. Previously, did you say that in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, Martin Luther King Jr. condemned the riots?
No, it's not in language of the unheard. He condemns violence in a lot of places. So yeah.
Just in the middle. Just in the middle of Letter from a Birmingham Jail, he says, "In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence." But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possessions of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act by the misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion?
I can still, I know that you're referring. What actions is he referring to that they're condemning? He's not referring to violence.
Let me read you another quote from the Letter from Birmingham Jail. He says, I started thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the community. One is a force of complacency made up of, I'm not going to use that word, who as a result of long years of repression have been so completely self-drained of self-respect and sense of somebodyness. And then the other force is one of bitterness and hatred and comes perilously close to the advocating of violence. It is expressed in the various black nationalist groups that are springing up over the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. The movement is nourished by the contemporary frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination. So yes, he does condemn
this isn't even a debate. Of course, he condemned violence of the protesters. When he's talking about they precipitate violence, he's talking about the strategy, which was to go and get the shit beaten out of you by cops. That's what he's talking about. Am I wrong? Wait.
Violence will not.
What, was I wrong about that or what?
No, you're right.
Okay, thanks. Cool.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
What were you getting at me for then?
I asked and double checked, but
okay, cool.
This bit here, I'm sorry. This bit here is he. I'm sorry. Never mind. Honestly, I don't care about this.
I can clarify. He's talking about precipitating violence in the sense that, yes, they did want the cops to react to them violently, because when they didn't, when they went to Albany, the sheriff there was very strategic. They were very calm with the protesters, and then basically they left with nothing. So when they went to Birmingham, where Bull Connor was a fucking psycho, they knew that getting the cops to attack them would look very good in the press, it would look very good internationally, and it would bring civil rights to the forefront. Yeah.
Right.
So it's the violence of the cops.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. That's fine.
If I can suggest a redirection, and this might actually be a more productive conversation as opposed to simply a debate. There seems to be an
running away from the topic at hand. Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, not actually. I'm actually going
Whick,
directly towards your approach. The assumption that the opticality to a general public is critical to the success of a social movement sort of presumes that social movement, or the group that constitutes a social movement, for example, if it's a case of an ethnic group asserting its rights against the broader majority, that group has to not be held in contempt in the first place. There is a long history of social movements of oppressed ethnic groups, so on and so forth, that is simply never recorded. This is one of the things I bring up in my opening statement when I talk about there's a bit of a survivorship bias going on here, in which we count the successful movement as representative of all of the quote-unquote violent fringes that may themselves have common cause with the mainstream movement, but are actually have their own discrete goals and values and constitution, et cetera, that are nonetheless sort of disappeared because, well, this movement succeeded, therefore they were just lucky enough to succeed along with them, despite the fact that they chose a losing strategy.
Do you not think do you not think even just real quick, even
Yes.
in a because I take issue with the foundation of your statement here. So
Really?
let me simply ask that: do you not think that people's perceptions of a group can be changed? So even if a group is despised, do you not think that over time and with effort, that the public perception of that despised group can be changed in a more positive direction?
Well, the public perception of a group whose overt oppression people are comfortable with, say for the example in a group that has been enslaved for a significant amount of time, that group's perception is not going to be changed by that group more quietly accepting their oppression or being more passive towards it. There's going to be some kind of instigating factor
There's a
that causes an
difference
explosion of
between
attention to it.
accepting your oppression and then being violent. Civil resistance is resistance.
Oh,
You
I
are
strongly
resisting
disagree. I
your
strongly
oppression.
disagree.
You are resisting your
An
oppression.
active resistance.
You're just
an
not
active
doing
resistance.
it through blowing things up or
Well,
beating
no.
people
An
up.
active resistance is itself intrinsically violent.
Well,
And if
that's
you were
okay.
Come on,
Wait.
no,
It is.
no,
But MLK's,
no.
well then weren't all of MLK's disruptive protests, sit-ins, were these?
Well, I mean,
these are violent now?
this is Wick's thesis. He was very careful to say that a nonviolent protest does not indicate a peaceful protest.
Well, I think Whick would agree with me on this. He's welcome to correct me, but I think Whick would agree with me that these are examples, like MLK's protests. I know that these are easy examples to point to, but these are
They
examples of protests
represent a
that were
direct
very.
challenge. They represent a direct existential challenge to the way of life of Americans.
Yeah, but the problem
But
is
they
that
were
no
loudly
one.
disruptive, but not
The
violent.
problem is that
They
no
were-
one. The problem is that no one defines violence in this way outside of people who are trying to impress their first-year sociology teacher. It's like when you look at fucking. If you look at any of the academic literature in this, when they say MLK was nonviolent, they're not saying he was like law-abiding, well-behaved. Yeah, he broke the law fucking loads. He deliberately got himself arrested, but they still class him as nonviolent, right? When we say violence, I think we mean generally. Most people think destruction of property or physically attacking people. That's what most people mean by violence.
Well, that's sort of immaterial because the literature that's going to give you the information about whether or not nonviolent versus violent protest is more effective is not going to be using that late definition. It's going to be
They
referring
often
to
are.
They do,
whether
though.
or not it's going to be referring to
They
whether or not they were
sometimes
armed,
do. They don't
whether or not
always.
they targeted, for example, property as opposed to persons. And by the way, some of the literature is very interesting. They have definitions that you would find sort of unintuitive. For example, they assume that media coverage of broken windows will tend towards an understanding of a movement as nonviolent versus attacks on persons, which they will identify as being more violent. But when you actually look at the coverage of the BLM riots and protests that characterized them as violent, the thing they pointed to primarily, with the exception of some cases like the Rittenhouse case, was broken windows, burning cop cars, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And I think that this highlights the importance of not giving into this kind of framing and de-emphasizing it when it comes up. Like if you are really serious about this, then you don't want to spend your protesting your resources doing all this condemnation. You just want to keep on doing what you were already doing. Another thing I wanted to say to Sunday's point earlier about you not being held in contempt. This is something that receives support in the literature, that the martyrdom strategy that we're talking about of going out and getting yourself beat up, it's not very effective when the audience is not already sympathetic to your cause. Vigilante violence against like Black people in the United States has always been super common, but it didn't garner much sympathy from the primarily white audience until after a certain point, when the audience was paying more attention.
No, this is important. Why were they paying more attention? What changed between 1850, right, or let's say 1900 and 1955, what changed?
No,
what
it wasn't. It wasn't.
new factor was introduced into society that changed the dynamics here? Because there's an answer to this.
There's a lot
It
of
wasn't
answers
just-
to that. That's 50 years,
Yeah.
which includes 2 world
No,
wars.
no, there's a. very
I wasn't even
specific
talking
answer.
about that long of a time period. I was talking about like Eisenhower to Lyndon B. Johnson, like that short of a time period.
The main invention in that short of a time period that became much more common and much more widely produced throughout American homes was mass media, the television, things like that. This coincided, right, with the changes in perception, because we didn't just hear about it and things like that, but you saw it. You saw the black kids being hosed down by the cops. You saw
But
that.
you've identified,
right?
but Wick, you've identified a key weakness in nonviolence as a dogmatic strategy, in that you are relying on the media covering your movement favorably.
Yes, and the
not
media
simply
will cover
only...
you better
No,
in general if you are nonviolent. Yes.
It's also
I can bridge
just
this
not
gap.
true.
I can bridge
that's
I
untrue,
can bridge the gap that you two are having. I'm going to push back on maybe Wick a little bit here, but like there is actually a perfectly good example of when nonviolence can be pursued, and if it is completely ignored by the media and the system, then they kind of leave you with no choice. Mandela was a perfect, like him and the ANC pursued nonviolence for decades, but after they were outlawed and after there was like numerous massacres against nonviolent protesters, and after the fucking there were like forced removals of black communities like in the millions because they were making the cities too black, then they decided that violence was inevitable, so they channeled it. They chose to say, okay, we're going to direct this into sabotage. They went for they deliberately targeted infrastructure because they wanted to make the country ungovernable under that system.
Yeah,
Hey,
look,
here's
I'm
another
your mic.
never saying there's never an indicator, like there's
Hold on.
never a brief.
Wait.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Wick.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying that there's never a time for violence. Obviously, that's not true. There is, there are extenuating circumstances. There are edge cases. There are times where you are left with literally no choice. But my argument is that, on the whole, in general, nonviolent civil resistance is more effective and better and leads to better outcomes, because we
Except
have to
when it
also
doesn't.
look at what does success look like. When a violent movement, right, is successful, it is less likely to end in democracy. It is less likely to end in non-repressive regimes.
I would
To
like
be
to
clear,
interject.
this is because
Just a moment, if I may.
sorry.
I just want to interject.
This is bias from the moderator.
It is towards good conversation. So everyone present agrees there are instances where nonviolence as a doctrine is preferable and times when the opposite is preferable. Obviously, different countries, different situations, different times. Sure. I was curious on a point that got brought up earlier that I felt was under-discussed. They were talking about, well, you were talking about the degree of permissibility of violence in nonviolent movements. Because when we cite MLK, of course, a principled nonviolent actor, the way he talked about violence, rioting, property destruction, would have been considered by media today, and was then, to be overly permissive and tolerant of the violent elements of the civil rights protest. That is to say, while many in the media look to see uncritical denunciations, he would often qualify, he would categorize, he would explain, oh, well, sure, I think it's bad. However, and for that, he was often blamed for enabling the violence. To what extent do you think a non-violent movement has to condemn inevitable elements of violence that exist alongside them? How much is too far? If MLK had to toe that line in a way that upset people on both sides, I don't think there's an easy answer.
Well, I can give an answer that's actually affirmative on Wick's side. So, for example, if somebody on your side is proposing to do something horrifically violent, like to the point where we would consider this to be unpalatable, say, for example, the kidnapping and torturing of the children of whoever in order to provoke some kind of positive political response, I think under certain conditions there is a moral threshold where you would actually decide, no, like the cost becomes too high, or regardless of whether or not on balance some onlooker might like consider these to be even, you would not partake. And I think that everybody on my side would probably agree with that.
Well,
In fact, I think-
the question is, I thought isn't whether you partake or not. It's when it happens. So when it inevitably happens, because again,
No,
nothing is a monolith.
you would condemn. You would
how
condemn
would
and
you
you would go
respond,
against.
right?
You would condemn and you would go against, probably in as strong terms as you would say, Wick. Because once again, like the threshold here for why violence is considered, why violence must be left on the table is because there may be a threshold beyond which violence is necessary. Because maybe, for example, media coverage at all is simply impossible. Maybe positive media coverage is impossible. Maybe the media is slanted in such a way as even if you have a nonviolent protest, it simply is intractable regardless. Maybe your community is so small, a nonviolent protest simply means you're invisible. Or maybe there are forces that override democratic ones that are, for example, running over your land with pipelines and bulldozers, so on and so forth. That media coverage, even despite being entirely positive, maybe there's an entire media empire sort of built around condemning that kind of thing. Nonetheless, it's inefficacious in actually stopping it. Maybe under those cases, you actually have to engage in violence to physically stop the progress of that machinery, and so on and so forth.
And also, to a point that we had earlier about the martyrdom strategy, why is it that police respond violently to peaceful protesters when it happens? I think
The smart ones don't.
Well, the smart ones
The
don't.
smart ones don't because they know it's going to make them look shitty.
But what conditions?
Do you think the cops look good nowadays? Like, do you think
I'm
people
not
are
saying
generally...
that. Wick, let me finish. What I'm saying is that in order for there to be a disproportionate police response, there needs to be a reputation or thought that these protesters are violent, that they are going to cause mayhem in the streets. This is the kind of thing that will prompt a disproportionate reactionary response from the police. If the police don't, if the police know that the protesters are not going to do anything, then what are they going to do? They're just going to handle them with kid gloves, and then the protesters are going to gain nothing. This martyrdom strategy then relies on the existence of violent flanks, because violent flanks are what make the possibility of they create the possibility of the disproportionate police response that you want.
Are you arguing?
I don't know if that's necessarily true.
We're not violent enough that the police will actually treat us better. That'd be a terrible world where the police treat protesters well. What a horrific outcome where police are treating protesters with kid gloves. What a horrific dystopian outcome.
Your whole point was that the martyrdom strategy is the best way of getting like social movements towards their objectives, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're serious about that, if you are serious about the martyrdom strategy, then you will be relying on the violence of certain fringe flanks in order to change your reputation.
I would like to hear.
Let me answer this,
I heard just a moment after you're done speaking. I'd like to hear from Professor Meat and from Doe as well. They both spoke up and have spoken less. But go ahead.
I'll be concise as possible. Like, martyrdom is one effective strategy. There are many others. When it comes to talk about civil resistance, there are very historically effective ways. There are protests in the streets that we think of mostly, but there's also stayaways. There's slowdowns. There's all sorts of kinds of ways.
If I may very quickly, just very quickly before if I can interfere just very quickly before we proceed to the two, and I'll be quiet.
5 seconds.
The problem, the Wick, is that the protests in the streets that you're referring to, they are either going to be passive when they encounter police, or they are not going to be. If the police, for example, simply do not engage in violence against the protesters, your martyrdom strategy fails because there's no active martyrdom.
That's not true at all.
Okay, sorry. Professor Meat, please go right ahead. You opened your.
I'm sorry, guys. I'll be real quick, and then you guys can go all you want. I'm just here to back up my buddy Wick. But no, I appreciate it. The only thing I was going to say is that I was going to point out is that the point of the martyrdom strategy, the reason the martyrdom strategy works, and part of why I don't think it's sort of a mischaracterization to say the martyrdom is like creating victims, not realistically in my mind, because the point of martyrdom ideally is to put on display malpractices, injustices that are happening on a daily basis, right? You're like in the case of ML in the civil rights movement, these are people, at least ideally, theoretically, who are like in a population who is going to be doled out injustice to them, who are electing to be the ones who it is done to so that it can be seen, right? And so that specific brand of martyrdom, you're right, isn't always possible. You can't always rely on the cops beating you up, but that's not the only way to put on display the negative circumstances that you're trying to protest against.
And
I've seen
likewise,
some other
please.
ways. Sorry, I've seen some other ways. Like some people do die-ins. If you've ever seen a die-in before, where they pretend to die on the floor. Most of the time, I've seen people talk about those. They laugh about them because they say like, "Oh, you guys are pretending like you have something that's so bad that's happening to you, but really you're fine because look, you're still alive. Things are still okay." Like that's.
Yeah,
that's part of that.
Like,
So
this poses a problem for.
I just want to
for
defend,
where-
but no, I want to defend my, I guess it's Just Up Oil, right? Because again, like, yeah, the cops are pretty well behaved with them most of the time, but they get a lot of attention, even if they just do a die-in. And what usually happens is it's not so much about making the protesters look good. It's because, again, civil rights protesters were not favored by the American public, but the legislation was favored. Same with Just Up Oil, because usually you'll get the default response from the average person to Just Up Oil is, "Oh, I hate those hippies, but also climate change is actually a big deal." Shit.
Yeah,
so
but the
what
thing is that Just Stop Oil supplements the sillier things that it does with like really extreme things. Like I think recently, a couple protesters went to jail for multiple years, or got sentenced to go to jail for multiple years because they got up on top of a bridge and stopped traffic across it for hours.
They were acquitted of that, I believe.
Sorry, they were acquitted.
If it's the case I'm thinking of, they were. Well, there was recently a case where they were put on trial to go to jail for possible years for obstructing traffic, but they were acquitted.
I can.
It might be
I'm
a
happy
different
to
one.
look
It might be.
It's kind of immaterial. Good for them, but nonetheless, yeah.
The point is that they do both, right? They do more extreme things than just the violence, right?
Yeah, that would typically be seen as like
blocking
civil
traffic. Hang on.
disobedience.
We'll slow down. Blocking traffic is very easily and often is construed as violence. Blocking traffic prevents people from getting food, from getting to the hospital. People die when traffic is blocked.
Yeah,
that's not a laughing matter. That's
So
the artery of society.
so if I block, hold on. Here's the thing. I would say that, for example, anti-abortion protesters trying to block access to abortion clinics for when people are trying to get in. I would say that that's violent protest because you are trying to obstruct somebody, specifically the person trying to get an abortion, from getting something that is like that they medically want, right? Do you not think of that as violent in any way?
The problem is if you define violence that broadly, then everything becomes violence. Like consuming almond milk is violence. Have you seen those supply chains? They're pretty fucking uneven and like coercive. So yeah, but the problem when it comes to
Why dismiss that? Why dismiss that?
At least, sorry?
I said, why dismiss that?
Because the good thing about language is that like we all basically mean the same thing.
The good thing about language, Loner Box. The good thing about language, Loner Box, is that we can take. Hang on. The good thing about language, Loner Box, is that we can take an expanded category and then we can particularize it. So we can say yes, in fact, violence takes place with a myriad of different types of activities that aren't equivalent to the physical breaking of another human being's skin, and then we can particularize corporeal violence, physical violence against bodies, violence against property, etc., etc.
No,
this doesn't present the problem.
It's making it harder to communicate. When I have
what
to
about
explain,
this wasn't clear?
When I
because then that means MLK was violent, right? Like,
and I say, hey,
but when you explain, but when you have to,
me, I need them to understand what I mean. I don't need them to.
But when you say a protest is violent, and somebody asks how so, you will have to explain in what manner they were violent, and what you will say is,
only
did they murder a person? Hang on. Did they murder? Hang on. Did they murder a person? No, they broke a window. Well, hang on. I thought violence was just harm against persons. Yeah, well, the property is an extension of the person. It's their livelihood, et cetera, et cetera. You're playing the exact same game.
No, but when you look at the majority of the literature, like violence is either destruction of property or attacking people. That's it. Like, you can broaden that if you want.
But that involves that exact same level of abstraction.
But then the problem is, we've just been having a whole discussion about whether MLK was non-violent, and people generally agree that his whole philosophy is not violence. But is boycotting bus services not violent because they bankrupted businesses? Yeah, you could say that, but then we can't communicate. Then we're just grunting at each other.
As Sunday said at the beginning,
I don't think that's true at all.
No, I also have no problem with. I also have no problem with biting that bullet. I have no problem with characterizing that as violent. That costs me nothing. That
it does. So oh my god. Yes, it is a problem.
If I could interject briefly,
please.
The moment you step away from anything done against another human body as violence and towards property damage also constitutes violence, you open up a gradient. Blocking traffic can impede people from accessing vital services. Striking as a worker can disrupt supply lines that people rely on to live. I don't know if there's an objective answer to where exactly, like the word violence, capital V violence. But to avoid the semantic discussion, I think unless you disagree, I think we can acknowledge the ambiguity of the gradient, and we can just specify what kind of violence we're referring to. Better that than back and forthing over whether or not this or that or the other.
Sure. My definition, and we can agree on this or not. You can, if we want to argue about this, we can. But my definition: physical to other people, breaking of skin violence, or direct property damage, like direct, not indirect.
Okay, but that or property damage though introduces exactly the same gradient that me.
No, it doesn't. We don't have to follow the string all the way down. We can just say we're stopping here.
We're doing it again.
Me, Doe, and Sirius are perfectly fine with accepting that there is a gradient of violence that includes these other things, and that violence can have different levels of severity depending on your perspective and depending on your values, et cetera, et cetera. There's no contradiction there whatsoever. However, when you're introducing an abstraction that is personal property that is perhaps very distant from the person, maybe some personal property of the wealthy, for example, may be so infinitesimal, even though so large compared to the average person, that its destruction doesn't even register to them until long after the event. They simply don't care. And yet, nonetheless, it can be used adequately to characterize a protest as violent or non-violent, depending on like whether or not there's a picture of a smashed window that can be put on the news. Right? Like a bank losing its window does not hurt the bank in any meaningful capacity. And yet, nonetheless, that can be used to characterize a protest movement carried out by a people who are actively being choked out from having access to essential services.
That's because people are going to categorize that violence in the same way that Whick is categorizing it.
Absolutely.
Because they're going to see the broken window and they're going to say that's direct violence.
Okay, so then isn't the problem then that we're just ceding the framing to the other side? Like that seems to be a huge part of the problem here, is that we're just ceding that it's violence.
Well, you can say that framing. Well, you can. The word doesn't matter. The point is that that's what people care about. That thing. Well, no, we can call it something. We can call it something other than violence. We call it flubgub for all I care. The point is that there's this thing that Whick was called.
That's not true. Hold on, that's not true.
Words are symbols.
It's just not true that the word doesn't matter.
Are you serious? The problem is that you guys are trying to go against a fucking like ages-long tradition of when we talk about the difference between non-violence and violence and protest, we typically mean violence being destruction of property and attacking people, and non-violence being like civil disobedience. And you guys are coming and trying to change the definition.
You don't actually mean by ages long. You don't actually mean that long. We haven't particularized.
Because if we the problem I have with the
you're just kind of stating that that's not.
We're also moving away from it in the literature. Like in the literature, they're moving away from violence versus non-violence precisely because it's so subjective and fuzzy. Like,
and it's a mistake. They're doing it, and that's a mistake.
No, but hang on. No, just an obvious counter to what Lonerbox is saying that demonstrates it's not true is that in political science since Weber, we've been characterizing the state's legitimacy as being by dint of its legitimate monopoly on
when I
violence.
Specifically say
However, at no point is it required that the state be actively engaging in violent corporeal action against human bodies at any single moment for it to have that legitimacy. We understand violence as, for example, existing in potentia.
People don't.
We do not talk about violence as involving simply the destruction of human bodies and or property. That's
this
inaccurate.
Is a problem, if I may, just real quick, without interruption.
No. If you're going to make a claim, if you're going to make an appeal to the traditional use of the term,
no. Can I respond to? Can I respond to what?
I'm not seeing
Whick, can I respond to what Sunday said? I was like, when I say in the literature, I mean specifically in discussions about political violence versus non-violence. Obviously, if you're reading like fucking Foucault,
that's literally what I'm referring to.
No.
Like sociology saying this.
No, I mean like contemporary literature when it discusses violence and non-violence. That's a bit different. Right?
Contemporary literature is what we were referring to.
Yeah.
Contemporary literature is what we are referring to when we say that it does not refer specifically to corporeal violence against skin and buildings.
So when people are when all these papers talk about like MLK and non-violence, even though he did things that literally got fucking bus companies bankrupt.
Colloquially in newspapers
and in the literature on violence and non-violence.
Peaceful.
Again,
the literature is far beyond.
You're actually just incorrect. I'm sorry.
So
yeah, if you're reading fucking Foucault, everything's violence. But
no, we're actually reading the same sources as Whick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the issue. When you want to communicate to someone, like what's going on, and you tell the average
What's
Joe
Foucault's
or
position on
Sally-
violence, Loner Box?
Is average
don't
Joe
care.
or
How does
Sally- I don't
Foucault
care about
define
Foucault.
violence?
Foucault is
I
one
hate
person.
Foucault.
I'm trying to talk to everyone. I'm
You
trying
never
to
read
talk to as
Foucault.
many people as possible. And the vast majority of people out there, and I will die on this hill, if you say, hey, my
You
movement
will.
is violent, they think of two things. They think of breaking windows, and they think of, well, breaking windows, burning cars.
Well, clearly
property
not.
damage.
Half the
And they think
debate
of-
panel does not agree with that.
Well,
I'm
hold on,
gonna tell you,
I'm an
yeah,
average Joe. I'm
Whick-
not in an ivory tower somewhere, dude.
To Wick's point and to what you said earlier, Sirius, like the reason I say the word doesn't matter is because if all of a sudden you called breaking people's windows something other than violent and you put it on the news, the fact that it was not being called violence is not what is determining whether or not people like
That's
it or disapprove
actually
it or
that's
approve it.
completely untrue. That's the thing. Like, we have done experiments on this where the exact same events are framed as either violent or non-violent, and people's perception of the legitimacy of the protesters
Yes,
changes.
I am sure that if you frame something as violent versus non-violent, framing it as violent is going to
But that's what you're appealing
what
to
I'm
when you're saying that the
what I'm
optics
saying
are what
is-
matters.
What I'm saying is the quality that Wick is referring to. What I'm trying to say
It's
is that even
Yeah, the words that
it's
you
not
use
purely
influence
optical. It's not
people's-
purely optical. Even in those scenarios, the bulk of the things that people are going to decide on whether or not they approve of it or disapprove of it is going to be the invocation of the underlying qualia. Right? People care about violence acts. We can call it. Yeah,
What's
like
the underlying qualia. What are you
the
talking about?
characteristics of the definition.
That's not what-
That's not what qualia means. I have no idea what you're saying.
Sure. Do you really have no idea what I'm saying when I say the characteristics of the definition?
Do you not
Yes,
see
I
the
have no
difference
idea what
between
you're
punching
saying.
someone in the face and
You don't know
blocking
what the
traffic?
the sentence
You
characteristics of the
do
definition.
not-
Yeah, I can tell you. I can actually tell you.
understand the difference.
Wait,
Yes.
hold on, because we ended up doing it anyway. I think the problem here is that the selective framing of certain actions as violent or not, and the subjectivity of that determination has literally been a tool of social control for as long as we've had mass media. So appealing to or even attempting to work out where exactly something falls in this line that is deliberately kept arbitrary to reaffirm the values of whoever gets to determine whether or not it is seems really counterproductive. We're obviously talking about a distinction between violence and social violence. There are plenty of theorists who speak on these issues who would happily side on either side of this issue, and we can also agree, I think, that whether or not something optically plays well and whether or not it's academically sound are two entirely separate questions. I'd be far more interested if we specifically referred to what kinds of violence or not we're talking about when we talk about what is justified, whether we're talking about breaking windows directly, strike action, deploying supply lines, whatever we mean. Because I think we could do this particular bit forever, you know.
Well, violent protest can involve, for example, the destruction of government property, attempting to bulldoze a traditional native.
I just want the specific acts being referred to over what could otherwise be an interminable discussion.
When I think about
Oh, well,
civil
it's going to
resistance, I'm
depend.
referring
It's
to
just
five
all
things.
going to depend on the context of the specific social movement. Like, there is no one size fits all for every social movement
Can
to.
we make one for this discussion, though? Can we make a one size fits all?
What? No.
Why
Because
would we?
Why would we? Because it changes. It changes based on time too.
Because
so, like,
what's
here's
going to happen is you're going to change it based on what it fits your argument. That's
Here's
what's going to
a-
happen.
No,
We're gonna
that's
chase
not
this
what-
kid- We're going to chase this dog
Here's a
all the way
question for you.
down.
But
Here's a question
here's
for
the
the
thing.
panel.
Even the
Reframing it
scholar.
No, hang on. I've got an
you
interesting
decide, that's what's gonna
moderator.
happen.
I've got an interesting question for the panel. I am curious about people's take on this. So I think we would generally agree that that there's a rising tide of transphobia in this country, as well as generally anti-feminist sentiment, et cetera, et cetera. Can anyone tell me in which province there was a stabbing of a feminist professor in the last month?
I read
No.
the article, but I don't remember the
In
province.
Canada?
Same here.
Yeah.
Canada,
Yeah,
yes.
I
Sorry,
think
Danny.
I heard about that.
And how much did that
Canada, I don't
cut,
care.
how much wind did that take out of the sails of conservative reactants against
None.
trans issues? None.
What's your point?
That is my point.
So,
That
is
so again,
it took no
isolated
wind out of the
incident.
sails.
If the
Isolated
targeted
incidents
community,
failing
if the
to, or
targeted
even
no
being
no no, if
successful in
unless
changing minds isn't even
unless
an argument.
unless the targeted community is not held in contempt, it lacks the capacity to change minds by passively accepting its oppression.
Yeah,
You
but that's
gotta have
because it's such
better
a
ev- you
singular.
gotta have better
Well, this is
evidence
no,
than a
that's
single incident.
that is kind of true. Like even like at the time it happened, Emmett Till didn't get that much attention at all. But then 10 years later,
Exactly.
everyone's paying attention.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I could say
There's a
if we're talking
swath of
about
stabbings of feminist professors. I
But
mean,
if
I
we're
think we see a
also-
different result.
if we're also talking about like how much did January 6th damage the Republican Party? They've been fighting each other ever since on that. So,
Well, although to
depends,
be clear,
you
as far as violent protests are concerned, very few deaths, very little property damage.
Yeah, but it was still everyone here. I hope would consider that violent.
Wait, why? Why was it?
But hang on,
Because it was
wait.
attacking
What
property,
if?
it was violence, and they attacked
No,
people.
but slow down,
They gave
slow down.
cops
What if-
PTSD
what
and
if-
someone died. That's why it's violence. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But what if that didn't happen? What if they just walked in, maybe someone shat on a desk? What then? Would that not be violent still? I would consider that violent.
Yeah, of course,
That's a direct
vandalism,
infringement of
yeah.
freedom of the
Yeah,
entire
yeah,
country.
violence.
Breaking into a building is probably violence. Yeah.
Well, no, I disagree with you,
Hold on.
Box. I think if they were
Or,
peaceful
like, the
and they had
vandalism,
simply
yeah.
come in,
Breaking
and not
into- wait.
vandalized, and
No,
not hurt
let 'em
anyone,
cook.
it would have. No, if I'm telling you right now, if they had come in, they had not vandalized anything, they had not hurt anyone, and they were simply peaceful, that would be looked on much differently. Are you kidding me? That would be looked on much differently,
more
by the public
favorably.
than it is now. Yeah,
I don't
It's still
know.
be silly, but it would be way more favorable than what they did.
Yeah, are you arguing against that? Do you disagree?
I mean, I didn't know about the cops being killed until long after. I knew about the person who was climbing the walls
That's
being
because you weren't
shot.
paying attention. That was like day of stuff.
I was watching it live day of. There was no coverage of that.
Well, sure, but that doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't change the fact that Wick's example, like the example of someone going in and taking a shit, would be viewed way less, would have way less of a disruptive effect on the Republican Party.
Yeah, I don't understand this point that you're trying to
Republican
make.
Party.
Obviously, if January 6th was less violent, it would have been viewed more favorably.
No, you're missing the point. There's
Straight up.
survivorship bias here in terms of what you consider to be a successful protest. You are identifying the ones that people cared about, and therefore they're accepting their oppression and being covered by the media in such a manner as their oppression actually became existent to the people observing it who weren't part of that protest. That depends on so many different things that most people in the world do not have.
Also,
Sure, I will
So do you
I'll
think-
just agree to that most movements don't succeed. Yeah, I'll agree to that.
Okay, but
that's
if
regardless of violence
most
or
movements
not.
don't succeed, if
That's
most movements don't
regardless
succeed,
of violence or not.
if most movements don't succeed, and what percentage do you suppose those movements are violent? Like we have a handful of cases to draw.
We have data on this, and you can you dispute the data if you'd like, but we have data from Erica Chenoweth, and you've been sent.
Your author
You should know the
disputes
sources.
the data.
The non-violence.
Yes,
is
your
more
author disputes the data.
Hi.
Your author disputes the data you are citing. Go on,
Wick,
Service.
I wanna point your attention to Erica Chenoweth, like her own characterization of her data. Like she has put out tables showing the difference over time between the violence, the success rates of violent versus non-violent protests. And if we see it changed over time, not after World War II even. So the 1940 to 19
So after World War II, it
Okay.
steadily non-violence became more and more and more effective.
Yeah, but for those first few decades after World War II, or rather these first couple decades, violent was more effective. So it's not to say that nonviolent is never effective. It's that it depends on the time and place and the conditions that you're in. Moreover, I want to point you to something else, which is that Erica's data has been analyzed by other people, which, that's good because her data set is huge and extensive, and I applaud her for that. But one thing is that when it was broken down by race, like the racial makeup of the protests, there was no strategic advantage to nonviolence when when it was a movement by a minority or disadvantaged population. Violent protests and non-violent protests had the same success rate for minority groups.
So even in the worst case scenario where a group is despised, non-violence or violence has no appreciable benefit towards non-violence, is what you're saying to me right now.
Yep.
Except in the most famous cases, it actually does and is
In the most
co-constitutive of a
famous
positive
cases,
effect.
what does that even mean?
Well, Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha movement in particular the decision, the success of that movement was also predicated on its contrary, which was the attack on British officers by the Indian National Army. Yeah. What you're probably putting your finger on is that in a situation, what you're probably putting your finger on, Whick, and I think we would agree on this, in a situation in which you have the capacity for positive media coverage, in which you are at some level of closeness with the powers that be, you are part of, for example, you are immediate subjects of the city in which those authorities reside, and so on and so forth. Nonviolent action has a greater effect when you have that type of relationship with the given authorities. But when we're talking about, there are a myriad of other cases in which that isn't the case, in which nonviolent action simply means...
Let me answer this real quick, because you're close, right? Because one of the goals of a civil resistance movement is to ingratiate themselves with the populace, to ingratiate themselves with the pillars of power, which support any kind of structure which they're trying to change.
Oh, that's not true.
That's not
to ingratiate themselves. That's not true at all. That's very
incorrect.
What
are you talking about? That's just...
What are they protesting against?
They may not want to ingratiate themselves. For example,
they want to make the people, because pillars of power that support a regime, an institution, a country, a society, all of them are run by people.
Did we want to ingratiate ourselves to the British when we were separated from them?
Too, Whick.
What are you talking about? We went to war with slaves. They ingratiated themselves with the North, and we went to war, and we killed them.
Yeah, that's not a protest. That's war.
Yeah, we killed them. We killed the slave owners, or we tried to.
But you still had whites-only institutions and places.
It took a while because 400, at the time.
But who are they ingratiating themselves towards? I don't follow you here exactly.
So it's important.
No, but at some point, the motive was not ingratiation.
Maybe you would understand, but you gotta let me finish. So what happens is, what you want to do is, let's take the 1978 Iran revolution, which was not violent. It's not often seen as
that's incorrect, my friend. That is very incorrect, my friend.
Okay, how many did they kill, the Iranian protesters?
The Iranian protesters?
How many did they kill? Yeah, how many did they kill?
I don't know.
I thought we also said destruction of property.
They didn't kill anyone because it was non-violent. You absolute moron. Okay, so let me educate you here a little.
I thought we said
the reason that worked.
I thought we said that property destruction also counted as violence.
The reason this works, right, is because the oil producers, the oil workers, are
you talking about Mossadegh?
Called a slowdown.
Hang on, sorry.
No, Mossadegh's 50s. Which? He's talking about the revolution in the 70s.
Different thing.
Okay, he did say the revolution. Sorry, I wanted to make sure. I wouldn't know if he said revolution or after that. Because Mossadegh, I would kind of get where he's coming from, but there were other problems with that. If he's talking about the Iranian Revolution of 1979, no, they fucking wasn't bloodless. Are you insane?
What are you talking about? So, again, the reason that it worked, well, it wasn't bloodless because the authorities at the time killed the protesters, and they would have a funeral and protest. So yeah,
between 1963 and 1979, he estimated 3,164 in the anti-Shah movement were killed. The Foundation of Martyrs identified 744 dead in Tehran, where the majority of the casualties supposed to have occurred. The coroner's office counted 895 dead, and Tehran's main cemetery. They were going against like a Gestapo type secret police.
No, when we talk about non-violent, I think he means the actions of the protesters, not against the state they're protesting against, right?
The state is going to. So even in the
they didn't have a dogmatic attitude towards violence that kept it off the table.
They did though. Okay.
Whose definition are you using of nonviolence? Are you still using Erica's? Because
be specific. Be careful here.
Well, because in Erica Chenoweth's book, like, you can read her footnotes, and specifically she says that the violence versus nonviolence distinction for that book is about whether or not there was an armed subset, or whether or not they were predominantly armed. So that doesn't line up with the colloquial definition that we're using, right?
Well, I'm just for whatever it's worth. I'm
with my point.
Yeah, for whatever it's worth, I'm going through like.
What it has to do with the point is that.
This is directly relevant to what. Just a quick clarification to make. Like, it could be the case that there was some violence from the revolutionaries going on at some level, but this is a little bit like I'm going through like it's paper after paper after page after page of people like overwhelmingly unanimously by historians. It seems to be the case that the Iranian Revolution that we're referencing was considered overwhelmingly peaceful. I'm reading articles about how one of the primary tactics that the people used was to go out and confront the soldiers and like literally speak to them and try to get them to come to their side. And it was at one point it was like over 1,000 people per day were defecting from the military police. It's like
they were ingratiating themselves into the pillars of power, and it was fucking successful. And this rewriting of history that we're trying to do, right, is just wild to me. When we have this documented, it's recorded, we can go and we can look at it. What broke the people is when the police who were the security forces were pulling people out of their homes to go work in the oil factory or the oil refinery or whatever it was called. They stopped doing that. They refused to obey. That is the purpose of getting people, of ingratiating yourselves into these pillars of power, is so that the pillars of power who would otherwise support the regime or the country or the institution stop doing so, not necessarily by defecting, though that would be great, but by simply not obeying, not complying, being non-compliant. That is the purpose. That's what works. That's what happens. I don't understand why you were fighting me on this.
Well, because it's not the strategy of every single protest movement. I think that...
Of course it's not the strategy of... I'm saying when they do...
We're talking about predominant. You can use the word predominant,
more likely to be successful when they don't.
So, but okay, that's not always true though, because what if your entire...
It's always true, but it generally is true.
Whick, are you going to let me speak? Is that these things are conditional on specific circumstances. And I think one instructive case is the South Sudanese like separatist or independence movement. Because when you look at that kind of thing,
the seizure of the American embassy by Islamic militants in November 1979, the consequent hostage crisis, and above all, the Iranian-Iraq war began in September 1980, strengthened the Islamic Republic because of the rally around flags and Trump. This was not a non-violent protest, Wick. You were incorrect on
We're
this.
talking about predominantly.
Primarily.
It's about being predominantly. Like,
Sunday, you interrupt.
You're sort of. I think Sunday, you're sort of doing the same thing that people do about BLM protests, where they say,
right?
yeah, sorry, BLM, where they say, oh, well, they point to violent things that did happen, and they try to characterize the protests.
Well, that's because the violent things were done by the movement.
No, I love it that we fought so hard against the right wingers being like, oh, mostly peaceful. Look at all these riots, and we were like, no, it's mostly peaceful. But now when it comes to the other side, it's like, oh, actually, like this mostly peaceful movement was really violent because
I'm not. I wouldn't say that they are mostly peaceful.
Right wingers.
I wouldn't say. Well, hang on. I wouldn't say.
That's the thing. We don't want to concede that. You guys want to concede the. Oh, sorry.
I wouldn't characterize BLM as nonviolent. I would characterize BLM as being besmirched in the sense of being characterized as sort of barbaric and sort of wantonly violent against persons in the street. But I wouldn't characterize them as nonviolent. They are intrinsically.
Would you characterize it as predominantly violent?
What did I just say, Professor Meat?
I'm asking a clarifying question.
I was literally just saying it's intrinsically violent.
Oh,
okay. Well, the reason I asked the clarifying question is because I don't think any reasonable person believes that, except maybe some far right Republicans. No one.
Rob Door's in my chat cheering you on.
It
Rob
wasn't
Door's
predominantly violent.
Yes, Queen. Yes.
No, because violence encompasses. Well, no.
He's in here
no.
cheering you on right now.
No, sir. Hang
on. Wait. Wick.
All right.
Wick. No. Hang on 1 sec, Vaush. I'm so sorry. Wick, you yourself would characterize violence against property as being violence. Destruction of property is violence, yes?
Even under that
would you deny that BLM riots involve violence against property?
Even under that prior characterization, I would consider
No, the destruction of property is inherently violent. We are in agreement on this.
And
everyone here is in agreement on this.
They didn't destroy, they didn't blow shit up. They didn't burn things.
BLM. What are you talking about? That was the entire. That was the basis of Rittenhouse. That was the basis of Rittenhouse even being in Kenosha. He was defending property because property was being destroyed. What are you smoking?
No one's saying riots didn't happen.
Sorry, no, we all agree on this. BLM protests were mostly peaceful. Some of them were riots, right? We all agree.
Absolutely.
Okay,
but
fuck
you
me.
can say that about literally everything.
And they dropped in popularity when the riots dominated the media, right?
My apologies.
Okay, but when they dominated the media, right? Not when they were at their most prominent, but when the media started to focus on them and characterize them as violent.
I mean, it does, when a riot happens, people are going to cover it, of course, even if you're, even CNN, remember CNN got, they looked so stupid with this reporter saying mostly peaceful protest with a burning building behind them. Media is going to do that. It's a riot. Of course, people want to see a riot on TV.
Yeah. So, and then what happens when like the media invites you on to talk about like your movement, right? In the wake of a riot, do you go up there and you're like, oh well, these people, you know, these are the bad ones. Like I hate them. Like we need to make a concerted effort to not have so many violent protests. Like
As Vaush referenced, as the moderator referenced earlier, MLK gave us a very good playbook for this. He condemned the riots, but also condemned the underlying conditions which caused the riots. He used this as an opportunity not only to distance himself from the violence, but also to reiterate into his audience the conditions which he was protesting.
How much ink did he give to one versus the other?
Quite a lot.
What do you mean? How much ink?
Like
he spent quite a lot of time.
Books that were proportionally.
Regardless of ink, he spent so many man hours. Like this was like one of the most fundamental parts of like. I don't want maybe training is the wrong word, but the type of discipline that he instilled to his protesters.
I'm not talking about training. I'm talking about when he was like making speeches to people.
You can even see that speech that he gave. You can even see like because the philosophy of nonviolence was like essential to him, and it's like you can even see the speech where he said like if every black man in America or every black person in America came out in favor of violence, I would stand against them and say this is wrong. Yeah, he was pretty passionate in that direction. But again, I don't think I disagree with you. He said, yeah, we condemn the violence. That's not what we're about. Back to civil rights issues. Is that
sure.
Do you serious? Do you disagree with any of that as a strategy?
With what as a strategy?
With
like
you're saying you seem to be, you've done it like 3 times now. It's like you seem to be very like you don't seem very sure about how to respond. Like if you're on TV asked to condemn the riots or whatever, but it seems like it's pretty simple to just be, yeah, we condemn the riots. We don't stand for that.
I condemn the riots, and then well, yeah, but that's the thing is that I don't think that. I don't mind doing something like that strategically. What I mind is that is like this incessant focus on it. If you're going to like give a quick condemnation of the riots, whether strategically or because you really believe that the riots are bad, then you should do it quickly.
Well, you should be, if I may, you should be very particular, right? So for example, if you're going on TV and you say, I condemn the riots, and you are not aware that the media has portrayed the protests categorically as riots, well, then that is being used to condemn the peaceful protests as well. You have to be very particular. You have to say, oh, I am unaware, for example, of people doing X, Y, and Z, throwing grenades into squads of cops or whatever, and I condemn that, of course. Most of us aren't doing that. That's one thing. And of course, like, there's nothing wrong with if being asked, like, are you in favor of your movement eating babies? Of saying, we don't do that, but of course I am, obviously. But when you're talking about, like, do you condemn the riots, quote unquote, and the movement as a whole is being characterized as riots, and adjacent movements are being looped in as riots? Of course, you would be.
I also don't know what you mean by it being this like incessant attacks on riots and like nothing. I don't know exactly who's doing that. I mean, maybe I could even flip it the other way. It seems to be the case that when BLM was happening, the response on Twitter was like mostly people saying, "No, it's mostly peaceful. Fuck you." But yeah, there are some people in there, but like, rioting's based, you know.
But Lonerbox, hang on, Lonerbox. We all agree that BLM is overall majority like a peaceful, quote unquote. We can talk about the ambiguities about that.
You just said like 10 minutes
but we all
ago
agree
that it was inherently violent.
Yes, because I don't treat violence and nonviolence and peaceful as synonymous. Just like you, I'm actually the only reason why I'm allowing this is because I'm basing this off of what you said in your opening statement, Whick. Like we all agree though, the vast majority of people in BLM protests are not, for example, breaking windows or throwing rocks at cops, etc., etc. And yet, nonetheless, when you look at the news coverage of these protests, what is overwhelmingly shown are burning cop cars and broken windows and dark, like cities at night with the glow of fire in the air. Like, they absolutely characterize these things as riots.
But the problem wasn't showcasing that. The problem was, and I think the reason to answer Sirius is
you don't think the problem was exaggerating that?
Isn't that a reason to be less violent?
You'll find out what I think the problem is in a moment here, if you let me. Right? Is that as the reason why it sometimes seems as if we're constantly harping on it, because every time we said we want to try, hey, we condemn the riots, we condemn the violence, let's talk about the issues, someone out there raises their hand and says, actually, I think the riots are based and we should do more of them. And then we have to deal with that chuckle fuck, right? And that's a problem.
Sure.
You have to deal with them.
I will also say, like,
you don't have to acknowledge them. You can just keep talking.
They exist. They will cause some level of problems to you.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's probably good that when you have the opportunity to stand against rioting within your movement or like excessive force and all that, like, yeah, you probably should do it. I don't know what's wrong with that. And actually, one of the big reasons the protests were mostly peaceful was that they did that. When people tried to antagonize and tried to be more provocative and try to smash shit up, the protesters were they were so mean to them. Like they made sure that that's just what they didn't stand for that. And I think that's a good thing to do. Again, like, that's a specific thing. Do you disagree with that, Sirius?
No, I don't disagree with having discipline in a given protest action, but that's the problem I'm having is that violent protests, when they happen, don't tend to happen as the result of like this planned organized effort. They tend to be spontaneous. They tend to be unplanned. They tend to be organic. Like, these kinds of things will happen. And so it's one thing to say when you are in a movement circle and you are planning to have a protest that you want to instill a certain kind of discipline into your protesters. That's one thing. It's another thing to like go out of your way to like respond to what right-wingers say about your protest movement when the more violent flanks do their thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think we disagree then, right? Not really.
Well,
on that particular point, it doesn't seem to be.
I have a question, if I may. So, you know, obviously, if we're talking about the optics and effectiveness of different types of protests, you know, over here in America, most of our protests are nonviolent. Whereas if you're in, like, I don't know, Syria, the only way to protest getting a pothole in your street fixed is by forming a militia and firing rockets at buildings. You know, there's contextual determinations. The question I have is, where's the line? Or to put it another way, if you saw a protest starting peaceful and then it started to tip into violence, how far gone would things have to be for you to look at that and go, okay? Because it's easy to do that in retrospect, right? I mean, there are lots of protests that we get to look back on for lessons to learn, but we don't learn the important lesson, which was what should we have thought at the time? In America, at the time of the civil rights protests, after all, the average person thought that the civil rights protests were a violent movement, that they were disruptive and disorderly. If we'd been listening to optics frogs back then, ones we would now disagree with in hindsight, we might have had a different answer. How do you judge? When is it okay to take a movement in that direction? Since we all agree there is a point, I just want to know where it is for you all.
I think it's when there's.
Asking for clarification? Just so I know what you're asking. Are you asking when we think it's morally justified that people get violent, or are you asking when we see something get violent, when should we rein it in?
Probably the former, I would say, because if you agree there's a point, and obviously it's a hypothetical, of course, you know, it's not like a tomorrow thing, but I guess I'm wondering what qualifiers you're looking for.
If I may very quickly, there's a famous cartoon that you will often see on the internet. I can't remember the name of it, but it shows Martin Luther King in front of a journalist. What the fuck is his name? Montgomery? I can't remember. There's Montgomery in the name somewhere. And it's a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. in front of a vast destruction, like a vast ruin of a city block. Okay. While he was active, Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement was not perceived by the general public as simply nonviolent. It wasn't even necessarily viewed as nonviolent by the vast majority of people. So one of the problems you're up against here is that your empirical data, despite the fact that, yes, we all concede to the data that says, however problematized their identity of violent versus nonviolent is, and however however various it is depending on the paper you're citing, there does seem to be, in particular conditions, advantages to nonviolent protests, and none of us would disagree. Obviously, nonviolent protests have succeeded in some cases. There are cases where it works. Nonetheless, if you're going to say that categorically nonviolent protest has an advantage in terms of optics, if your empirical cases, especially the major ones, did not actually have that optic while they were operative, that's a bit of a problem for
But
you. That
that's
kind of
not-
removes your empirical basis.
That cartoon you're referencing was a piece of right-wing propaganda that failed, though.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, it
that
didn't work.
optic did work. Like that's why the thing that went all around the country and even internationally were those images of peaceful protesters getting beaten up by cops. That was the entire message, was that these peaceful protesters who were all suited up and just trying to absorb the blows are just taking it. The optics did work. And actually,
what is your basis for saying that, though? You say it doesn't work, but
what did I say? It doesn't work.
The civil rights movement was passed. Like the civil rights succeeded. That's what I mean.
Yeah, they got the legislation passed. This was like one of the most successful decades in like African American history. No, like
I think that the appeals to international audiences is I think separate from how it was perceived in the United States itself, because what reaches overseas is not necessarily going to be like the propaganda that's influencing the average American person, because though amongst Americans, MLK was super unpopular.
He was his popularity got quite big towards 65, and then it dropped again after, because a lot of movements which were not MLK's did become violent. Yeah. The Vietnam protests. But no, the impression generally was that you're right, most of the Americans didn't support the demonstrators at the time, especially like freedom riders and all that, but they still grew in favor of civil rights legislation, and the people they were more appalled by was the cops and the segregationists, because they were literally fucking burning buildings down, and like they blew up a church that got 4 black kids killed. Like that was what the people really condemned.
Yes, and let's not forget, right, like
but what you're pointing to, though, is that in the absence of that extreme violence, that not taking place, that's violence by the opposing side. But suppose that hadn't happened.
Yeah, when it didn't,
falls flat on its face.
No, I said that.
I suppose that those 4 black kids were killed. Your strategy works.
It depends on which issue, right? The bus boycotts worked because no one used violence on either side. They just bankrupted a bus company, and then they were forced to desegregate. But no, you're right. Like Albany failed because the cops were being really strategic, and they didn't strike the protesters. So that's true. Yeah, like I mentioned that earlier.
This is the issue here. Is the morality. The morality of the thing has.
Well, it was negotiated after the boycott. No.
One of the problems we're having,
the negotiation was to bring it in line with other southern cities,
which was desegregating, though.
No, it was not, because in Montgomery it was specifically there was a specific version of segregation in Montgomery. So in most other southern cities, it was seating whites front to back and blacks back to front. And then wherever you met in the middle, that was whatever, right? But in Montgomery, there was like a specific 10-person seating arrangement that was like a middle area where, which was supposedly for everyone, but black people were asked to leave that middle area even when they had the right to be there. So like there was a very particular thing that they were fighting against. They didn't even fight for full desegregation of the buses. They fought for a different kind of.
Well, what about the diner sit-ins?
No, but it was a success. That bus boycott was considered a success at the time, though, wasn't it? They did push to get like the change without violence on either side. That's all I'm saying. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, I'm not wrong. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Sorry.
My point is that it was really modest. It was not desegregation. It was a different kind of segregation.
Okay. So yes, sometimes you don't get every single thing you want in the first time. It's an incremental process, and people don't like that. But incrementalism absolutely works, and it's slow and it's frustrating. But that's how you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. Okay, you don't try to shove it all down your throat all at once. But the problem we're getting into here is like,
what are you talking about?
Incrementalism and why it's based. So, but the problem we get into here is,
hang on, but.
But seriously, saying, well, yes. it only got some success. So can we really?
Yeah, but that was true before the 50s as well. Before the 50s, they had Brown versus the Board of Education, which was that ruled segregation of schools unconstitutional. Yeah, there were loads of steps taken even before the 50s. Yeah.
To be clear, I'm not saying it was unsuccessful. I was just disputing what was said. I was correcting the record on what was being said about it. That it was a success in that it got the buses desegregated. It was not a success in that the buses got desegregated. It was a success in that they aimed for something pretty small and they ended up getting it.
It's desegregation. Let's say that. How's that? Is that better?
Their broader goal. I mean, that was personally the broader goal of many of the movement leaders, but it wasn't the explicit strategy that they were employing. They were not going for that. They were not arguing for that to be the case. They were not asking for that. They were asking for a different kind of segregation.
Yeah, it was a first step in a larger plan and a larger movement to get eventually civil rights in general, right? And it's still, to be clear, right, I don't think that the civil rights movement and the civil rights era fully got 100% of what it wanted or what it needed. I think there's still work we need to do, but I think that we can point to it as
there's still work
resounding
we need to
success.
Do. What are you referring to?
No, wait, sorry. Like the timeline is well serious. So the company did what you said, but then they actually did desegregate fully in 56, right? So that's the incremental. Yeah, it's a one thing at a time. Yeah. This is a nice conversation, isn't it?
Did we ever get answers from the question that Vaush asked?
No.
Oh, I was going to say if you have one. I wanted the threshold, right?
Yeah, at what point? Because the reason I asked this is because the deference to public opinion isn't really a reliable metric in the time. Depending on which polls you go by, something like 80% of whites didn't think that protesting would help the blacks' cause back during the civil rights era. And, I mean, in retrospect, we understand the protests were good anyway, but how do you make these determinations about whether or not any protest is viable or optically beneficial, or if violence is the right answer?
I think a really good example of that is Mandela, because I like citing those people because they're like very successful at what they did, right? Is that they tried nonviolence for a very long time, but it was only after every like other nonviolent avenue had been exhausted that they resort to violence. And that's usually because you get to a stage, whether it's like South Africa or Palestine or wherever, where violence basically becomes inevitable and you have to do something with it, which is what the ANC did. But that was, I mean, the threshold for that was like, I think Mandela adopted violence after the government forcibly removed 60,000 people from a village in a neighborhood in Johannesburg because they thought they were making the city too black, which is an insane threshold, right? Like forcible removal.
One of the assumptions that's kind of undergirding a lot of this, discussion is that nonviolence is efficacious, presuming that the protest is only against policy and not, for example, as in the case of the Iranian Revolution, against interference from some kind of colonial metropole. Your very country, not you, Loner Box, of course, is established by means of very violent protest.
Oh, are you talking about the Revolutionary War? Right?
I am,
yes, I will see that prior to World War II, prior to the advent of mass media, the variables were changing.
No, of course, but you see the fundamental weakness of your position, though. You have to presume that the people who are protesting want the status quo to persist. But
why? Why do I have to assume that? And I want to answer
because the power
question,
because you're offering
every time.
Well, no, because your arguments presume that all that is taking place is a shift in policy by the same powers.
That's not true. My
yes, it is.
Even if you want leadership change, let's look at what happened in, I think, Serbia back in '98, where they basically ousted the leader who tried to steal the election. Basically, the Butcher of the Balkans at the time tried to basically steal the election entirely. In that protest, entirely nonviolent, keep in mind, was actually successful in regime change, which is far better and far more far more ambitious than simply policy changes. I'm talking about things where there's a secession of territory, like where occupation of a territory stops. Okay, these things work both on the policy level and also on the broader overhaul, more kind of revolutionary level, if you will. The problem is it works whether your cause is just or unjust. We see a lot of very fashy, very bad actors adopting a lot of the rules for radicals playbook and a lot of these the playbooks of the more nonviolent resistance, civil resistance, to success, right? To their benefit. And this is a problem that I think that researchers are dealing with nowadays, is that
but he was
ways of going
was
about
with
it are
military
effective
counteraction.
regardless of the morality of the thing. But I want to answer Vaush's question real quick before I forget. Is that my line is when they are directly. Basically, it's a very high bar. I understand, but when they have removed all other means of change. So if they've prevented you can't vote anymore, they are putting you in camps, they are killing you. Yeah, there comes a point where you just have to take up arms.
So after they've already succeeded in killing you is when we can start to
well,
rise
you
up.
understand. Well, hang on, Sirius. You do need to remember the wise words of my prime minister: when you kill your enemies, they win.
I mean, the problem with that argument is that you're assuming that violence would have saved people beforehand, which again is like that's kind of shaky, right?
I don't know. Is it?
Depends on what you're talking about. I don't really know if like.
I agree.
I don't
Yeah,
really
but
know
that
if.
works both ways,
depends.
right?
I don't. Yeah, but like, let's say you know that stupid fucking Ben Shapiro thing about if the Jews were armed, they could have stopped the Holocaust. Well, I'm like, no. If there were fucking Jews running around in 1930s Germany killing people, what do you think the response? Oh, actually, I think Jews are okay now. We'll just chill with them. No, they would have got worse, like quicker. But I don't know.
Well, it couldn't have hurt. I don't know, dude.
I don't think
at the point where they're rounding them up and putting them into a furnace, I'd say, give it a go.
Do you think in the 20s,
I mean,
Jewish militias would have been effective in like Germany? I think it's probably quite easy to say no.
I didn't say they would have been.
Would have been effective.
Doing
He
it
said
what?
couldn't hurt.
If one time traveler could make the difference, then presumably a time traveling militia of Jews would also be able to make the difference.
I'm just a painter. Why are all these people trying to kill me?
Hey, a new Netflix series coming out, right? The time traveling Jews. They're going back and solving all the world's problems. No, I think that again, the problem with violence is once you open that box, it's like starting a wildfire. You can't necessarily control what happens after you kind of unleash this thing.
Wait, you can
The response
anyways.
could
You
give
already can't control what happens.
You can.
Yeah.
There are more. You have more options when you are less violent.
Who is you?
What? Yeah.
Wick, if people in your movement are engaging in Wick, no, Wick, no, this is important. You seem to have this conception of political movements as if they're like a faction, like a unit in a strategy game, where you can just pick the non-violent option. If members of that group engage in violence, and that is then used to characterize the whole group, thereby making, for example, maybe violence the only viable option available to them, and so on and so forth. That's not true in all cases. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, you don't have the capacity to redirect a movement once it's already committed itself to a certain type of action.
If you can't control
or what's a certain type of action.
Okay. If you are in a situation where you cannot control what anyone else is doing, you have lost. But you always have the ability to at least somewhat control what
no
your
individual.
movement does.
Wick, in any given movement, the vast majority of people, maybe all of them, can't control the direction of the movement. Whose position are you assuming when you say control the direction of the movement?
Look at the civil rights movement. Do you not think that MLK had very strict and tight controls over his protests?
He didn't have control. He had influence. And no, he didn't have unanimous control over every black civil rights actor or every black rights actor and so on and so forth.
The reason that the civil rights movement was so effectively nonviolent across the board was because multiple organizations were not like even I think it was like the overwhelming majority of black Americans were pro nonviolence. Like Malcolm X was just like, I mean, he was a represented a very small minority at the time.
Yes, so you have that fortuitous situation. And Wick, I agree.
It wasn't fortuitous. Do you think
it was incredibly fortuitous.
Wait, no, stop. You were making this argument that this was an accidental thing, that it just happened.
It would take so little.
No,
Wick.
this took work. It took effort. It took time. It took
Wick. What Loner Box Wick. Wick.
Eat it out.
Find your chi. Wick. What Loner Box is indicating is that there was this immense scaffolding that allowed, for example, protest doctrine to be enforced, to be disseminated.
How do you think that scaffolding came about? Do you think it appeared?
Because it happened to be the case that in this particular time, in this particular place, particular people formed organizations and community roots that allowed them to influence the movement of large numbers of people. That is not always the case. Sometimes, for example, protest is the result of top-down action and is spontaneous from multiple sectors at once, in which case none of these sectors has unanimous control over all of the others, and sometimes some of them are engaging in violence. The only way to counter that violence, if you prioritize that, is to cut the legs out from the whole of the movement itself.
But
I think if you're talking about an act of violence, I think it should be quite easy. Like, we can only act with the information we have right now. I think if you can just justify any particular act at a time, just do that, right? For example, looking back at Stonewall, I think that was perfectly justified because they were literally fucking raided in their space by the police for no fucking reason, right? The burning of the police precinct, I don't know if that should be after George Floyd died, right? I don't think that should maybe be adopted as a strategy, but they were perfectly justified in doing that. The state literally failed the people they were supposed to protect by letting one of their agents murder a guy. So, well, but that's just take an incident. That's what we're advocating. But is anyone advocating the how would I put this? Fuck. I feel like I can't even ask this question because it's like Fed posting. But if we're talking about, does anyone think that America in 2023 is in a stage where violence would be a reasonable strategy?
Wait, violence blanketly? What the fuck does that mean?
Well, to the okay, so
you just let me ask.
Yes, I agree. Yes. I will say yes. Wait, yeah, but I'm answering.
Okay, you can answer.
I agree. My preferred policy position is kill.
Listen,
just kill.
Okay, memes aside, I'm curious what Doe thinks. Doe.
I need to clarify what I mean by violence, right?
Please.
No, I understand. Well, I want Doe to answer the question. Doe, do you think
Continue.
Do you think that in 2023 in America, violence, in whatever form you want to define it as, is the answer here? Do you advocate, or would you advocate for violent agitation, disruption, protest, whatever you want to call it? Can you elaborate? I want to give you space to elaborate because I don't want this to be Fed posting, right? But
I think that so I care about what's just, and I think that solidarity is the method of justice and freedom, and that I think that is a far better tactic than blanketly nonviolence. I think that, like, knowing that the person next to you will help de-arrest you if you're at a protest and a cop starts engaging in violence against you, or knowing that, like, you know, these kinds of things. I think that I do think that violence is acceptable in certain cases, in certain times in 2023 America. Like, yeah.
De-arrest as in like fight off the cop who's arresting someone.
De-arrest? Yeah. Have you ever seen a de-arresting?
Yeah, like I haven't seen one, but it's okay. So a cop's arresting someone. No, I haven't seen it, but a cop's like Just Up Oil, like they're getting arrested, and other people should like muscle the cops off of the protester.
Have you? This is a very common protest tactic. It's called de-arresting. You should look into it.
Okay, I mean, if you want other people to do that,
you don't even need to muscle them off. Like, what if you just like block their access to their vehicle? Like we said, blocking traffic is
you're committing violence against the monopoly on legitimate physical violence. Here.
Usually, people like push them over, push the cops over, stuff like that. That's usually the method in protests to stop them from like zip tying someone or whatever. They like. You know, they help break the zip ties and push the cop over.
Well, I'm just going to say here, right? Just going to say, first of all, do so at your own risk then, sure.
Yeah, of course. We're not demanding sacrifice, but, you know, any good movement for, you know, social change will accept some sacrifice because that's how it goes.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, and I don't know, and this is a legitimate question. I wonder if it would be more efficacious to allow the arrest, right? Because again, we have other.
Efficacious for who?
For the people who want to do the change.
The police famously arrest people as a secret, insidious protest move in favor of the protesters because they know that arresting the protesters is only to the advantage of the protesters.
Yeah, if you could demonstrate an unjust arrest, if you could demonstrate that somehow, which I don't even think you necessarily need to interfere with the police to do so. And this is part of the martyr. This is an extension of the martyrdom idea strategy, right? If you can demonstrate an unjust arrest, that's going to be extremely effective for your movement. Whereas if theoretically,
you mean if you can win,
as opposed to interfering with the police in an unjust way, in a way that is not interfering with an arrest that is otherwise not considered unjust, all that's going to do is arm critics of your movement.
No,
How
not
would you-
necessarily. So
Well, yeah, necessarily. Uncritical solidarity is not
You
an
have
ideal.
literally no evidence on this. Stop saying necessarily.
So, okay, can I
course
say,
people-
because
what
Loderbox brought up an example of this earlier with the contrast between the protests before Bull Connor and then the Bull Connor protests. Like, I don't remember the exact names, but as he was saying, like, before that, the police were really prepared and they arrested protesters and they actually made provisions to send them off to off-site jails. And the protesters got basically nowhere. And it wasn't until they came up against Bull Connor, who was like psycho, right? And started arresting people willy-nilly and like giving the orders to, or not giving the orders, but like the police got itchy trigger fingers, so to speak, right? And that ended up contributing to the martyrdom that we're talking about, right? So
Yes, the more violent the cops are, the more it's good for your
yeah,
vision.
but no, but that's the thing though, is right. Not all arrests are quote unquote unjust, right? Quote unquote unjust from the perspective of the legal
Can you
system.
give it, so
if you need to de-arrest, what?
So I'm asking. So when you say it's not unjust, are you talking about someone who's gone and blown up a police building?
No, we're
How
talking.
about this, Whick?
Then what are you?
How about
talking
this?
about?
How about this?
I'm talking
How
about.
How about someone who cements themselves in front of steamrollers and whatnot on legally sold land that is the traditional territory of some group, okay? That is not an unjust arrest in the eyes of the law. They are actually obstructing someone's rightful disposition of their own property. However, nonetheless, like they are protesting the unjust appropriation, misappropriation of an entire community's traditional territory.
Sure. If
etc.
you want to do that, but you have to. So in that
But
case,
you-
I think de-arresting hurts your cause rather than helps it. I
How?
think that allowing yourself to be
Because
arrested
how?
has a much bigger way.
No, because
For me,
because
I'll
the,
let
you
explain.
cannot. No, because the criteria for being able to use an unjust arrest as a protest move is predicated on being able to establish it as unjust before a general public. But the general public is presumably going to be the general public of some legal system, right?
No, because what you're doing when you
What?
allow yourself to be arrested is you're highlighting and calling attention to an unjust law. Look,
That
I'm
doesn't
doing
follow.
this, and I can
every
be
single
arrested for this,
Wait.
and police can do
That's
violent.
not
No,
true.
that just demonstrates the
legally.
existence of a law, Wick. That's all.
If you want to
protests could-
change the law,
The goal of a protest could be to draw attention to a law, right?
Maybe
Like, for
the
example.
protest that's being engaged in isn't one against the law that you're being arrested under. For
Yes.
example, police officers oftentimes say this has been deemed a you're not allowed to gather here anymore. This is an illegal gathering now, even though it is a legitimized protest. You know, they got permission from the city or whatever. They will declare it now illegal and start arresting people who are there. Like, you're not trying to change that law by protesting whatever it is you're protesting, whether
Yeah,
racial
so-
injustice or whatever.
So your thesis, Wick, is that they should allow themselves to get arrested because then it will highlight the law against squatting on someone else's property. That's not what they're
or the
that's not what
law
they're
in
protesting.
the case of
But they're
Doe,
not
right?
protesting squatting.
Well, I'll give
on
you
some-
a real world example of this, right? So there have been people who've
BlackRock.
been arrested. I'll give you a real
thought
world
we
example. There's people who've been arrested for
Why is it whenever we bring up
illegal.
an example, you just like say, "Oh, we have to talk about the generalities. We have to talk about the generalities." But now
Because
you're,
we can
like, getting
go
to
back
bring up
and
your
forth on
own
specific examples all night long, and we can say, well, in this example, in this.
But then what were you
example, but we
just
have
doing,
data,
Wick? That's what you
but
were
we
doing. You were
have
bringing up a
data.
specific example.
because the general data just disproves you. And
Now
so
we're
it
talking
would
about
be
the
a very
general
short
data. We've
conversation.
moved from every single time we talk about the general data, problems with the general data. Well, hang on, I've got a specific example. We'll hang on, Wick, but the general... No, but you can go back to the general data all you want. Okay, fine. Well, we'll do a specific example. We have a counter-specific example. Well, the specific example doesn't establish anything. We have the general data.
I think there's a difference between using an example to point to as a representative example versus using an example as either a typification of how things can, yeah, basically that, versus using an example as a typification or an example of how things can work, or
Yeah,
a
but that
typification.
that's what I
relies
was
on
trying
you
to
having demonstrated that it's a representative example. And
Well, no, that's what I'm saying is that the examples that Whick has protested again have been in the context of using them as arguing them as representative or applicable to a more representative
but you have
like
to
whole.
lay the groundwork for them being representative. You can't just say this is representative and then.
Well, wait, he's saying that ours were unrepresentative, and that's what Whick was pointing out. But I don't think that that's true, because the entire thing that we've been saying is not that these are purely representative of every single social movement, but that these are events which occur and which you cannot just dogmatically refuse on a basis of nonviolence, because many of the biggest ones are they still have to do with violence.
I've already seeded the ground that there are specific incidences, right? There are specific scenarios, there are specific contexts where violence is not only justified but moral as well, right?
We win, boom.
Moral, but
good job, gang.
But that's not the argument, as I said in my opening statement. My opening statement was clear.
You may say so.
It's not
the debate is non-violence versus violence,
or that violence never can work. My argument is that in general, non-violent civil resistance is more efficacious post-World War.
But you haven't established this. In fact, every single state that exists, every law-giving entity was established by violence. This is why sociology generally refers to states, refers to law-giving entities, refers to authorities and sovereigns as those who hold a monopoly on violence. Why? Because it is violence which establishes the case.
But by that definition of violence, voting is violence, and no one understands voting to be violence, so come on.
Well, also, the appeal to history and the creation of states is a little weird, because a lot of states were authoritarian, regimes were overthrown, wars were had, like, none of us are as saying that in the case, like...
They were overthrown, really? Were they peacefully overthrown? Were these regimes overthrown by non-violence?
That's
what are you
my
referring
point.
to?
Well, in some cases, yes, but no, that's generally not.
No,
that's my point.
In no cases. Never in the history of mankind has a state been overthrown non-violently.
I don't think
it's arguably not true, but that's not even my point. All of us agree here.
You said it.
I'm sorry, this is about what you're...
No, but that's a concession. That's a concession that damns you.
Can you let me
because
finish?
What you just...
No, it's not. No,
Professor Mead.
What I'm saying...
Professor Mead, go ahead. Professor Mead, go ahead.
Traitor.
What I'm saying is that no one here is saying either that there is no situation in which a war is justified or the overturning of an authoritarian state or something like that is never justified, and none of us are saying that if you decide in any case in history to do those things, that violence is not a reasonable way to do it. Of course, if you're going to literally overthrow a regime and institute a revolution, violence is justified. That's not the conversation.
So what you're saying, to be clear, is that violence is only justified in cases. Violence is only unjustified in cases where you're trying to make particular policy changes, but not for some reason in cases where you want to overthrow the entire normative structure.
Well, I think...
I'm saying specifically that violence is justified if you're trying to overthrow an entire structure.
No, but here's the problem. If you concede that in history we have myriad cases of entire legal systems being overthrown and restructured and reorganized, et cetera, by violence. Well, that's basically it. That makes it an intrinsically efficacious force.
Well, yeah, but if we're talking about a protest, the point of a protest isn't to do a insurrection. That's an insurrection, not a protest.
Well, that's not entirely true. For example, hang on. Wait. The Iranian Revolution was cited as an example of peaceful protest earlier.
It was.
That was precisely that, though.
All right, so you're telling me a minute ago when you said that peaceful protest...
That was not violent, so you're telling me...
Yeah, so you're telling me a minute ago when you said that there's never been violence over the regime.
Wait. Okay, Whick.
Yeah, so again, you cited that there's been no regime change that has happened that has been non-violent, but again, we can point to the 1979 revolution in Iran. That was entirely non-violent.
But it wasn't entirely non-violent. It wasn't entirely non-violent.
Entirely
non-violent.
It was mostly
non-violent. Hang on. Yeah. How did the Shah get ousted? Was he elected out of office? You don't know, of course. No, he wasn't. It was not a non-violent thing at all. It was marked by frequent attacks by the secret police against, for example, funeral arrangements and so on and so forth.
Again,
it was not
that
non-violent.
Didn't help the state; it hurt the state.
Yeah, we're not talking about whether or not the state was violent. We're talking about, I think it's pretty standard history that the Iranian Revolution, like on the revolutionary side, they were mostly, not completely, but mostly non-violent, right?
Yeah,
okay, but that non-completely part is important because the non-violent part didn't take over the state.
Is that true?
It absolutely did.
I read.
Khamenei got like 90-something% of the vote, right?
So So basically what happened is that because the Ayatollah stressed martyrdom as an Islamic principle, the protests were generally oriented around nonviolence. However, they were marked with frequent rioting, and the closer they got to actually taking over the government, the more violence became like an act of the state. So for example, the Ayatollah worked initially alongside communist and secular groups like the Revolution, or the National Front, National Front, I think. But then the closer they got towards actually achieving the full insurrection, the more sort of institutional violence got cemented. And then, of course, when the Ayatollah took reign, there were mass killings of the people who previously worked with him.
Yes, and guerrilla warfare was frequent. Sorry, go on, Doe.
Oh, I think I was actually.
Oh, was
Doe,
that
were you going to say something? I think I was going to say something. Yeah.
You're
So
good.
what I was going to say is that, like, I think the Iranian Revolution is also interesting insofar as it necessitated, at least at the end, violence against part of the protest movement, right? Like they required it. Like, how do you think they suppressed the communists and their former allies after they overthrew the government? Like, they
I
had.
think it would have been better if they hadn't.
I agree. I agree that.
So
it would have,
I just what do you mean
think?
necessary?
But you're talking about success, are you not?
Mhm.
You're talking about success. Do you not agree that part of the
I'm just gonna be real. A
success,
fascist theocracy, right, is not my definition of total success. It's partial success, right?
No,
But
because in the literature, when you say success, we mean achievement of
They
movement
their
goals.
goals,
We don't
do you
mean.
think they would have
we
not
left the goals.
achieved? Do you think they still could have achieved their goals without killing the communists? I think they could.
I don't think that they would have been nearly as successful, because then they would have had another political bloc that they would have had to contend with.
I feel like I added too much in that last, so I'm going to balance it out and provide an example of what could be argued to be an insurrection that was properly nonviolent. The People Power Revolution in the Philippines, which was an effort to oust a corrupt leader and succeeded, an end to a 20-year dictatorship. A famously peaceful series of protests. You can look it up. Enormous participation. Obviously, there were riots in the course of these protests. It's fairly inevitable, but the character of them was overwhelmingly peaceful.
I think
Yes, and
Armenia
we can look at
2018 is another good example as well. That was like that was a very peaceful revolution. Yeah.
In the Serbian in the 1998, again, I'm going to refer to that. We can go example over example of this, right? So your characterization of every single state has come to power through violence is just not true.
And it doesn't even matter, because if, like, assuming that it is justified,
Well, hang on.
no one here disagrees that assuming that it's justified to have a revolution, that you can't use violence. No one here thinks that.
The state is that entity which obtains a monopoly on the legitimate force of violence. It becomes a state by assuming that role.
Yeah, the original point.
That
The
doesn't
original point
contradict the
was
fact
that
that
history.
the events before they changed power is like mostly nonviolent, right?
That's,
Yeah, your point was
Like,
that
if I say that the
throughout
Armenian
history-
Revolution, if I say the Armenian Revolution was mostly nonviolent, and you say, but they adopted the state, which is a means of violence,
But
so
if
it doesn't really contradict it.
But if the critical moment involves acts of violence that give it the control of the state, and that's what cements the success of the movement.
Well, yeah,
the
like as soon
success
as
of the movement
the
is
Ayatollah took control in Iran, they killed a lot of
Similarly,
people.
but we don't even need something that's strong. So, for example, in order to like dogmatically hold to the idea that nonviolence was sufficient, you need to be able to go back and say, well, at any given point, if the circumstances which permitted the success of this movement involved violence by any other actor that was more or less on side, you basically have to assert that it would be impermissible, strategically or morally, to manufacture that if that wasn't present. If for whatever reason that event did not fortuitously take place. That's a very strong claim you have to make.
So again, you keep acting like we have to prove that in every single situation, nonviolence is the answer, and that's absolutely not what we have to do.
Well,
all
it's
we
not,
have to demonstrate,
well, hang
all
on.
we have to show is that in
to.
most cases.
But you haven't shown that in
There's
most
more
cases.
cases.
You have a handful
think
at best if I grant every one of the cases you provided.
Again, after post World War II, let's be clear. And again, I can cite the works of Erica Chenoweth, who has done
After
longitudinal
post-World War
study
II.
over 1,000 cases of not longitudinal. My mistake. I misspoke. She's done with a large sample size of events from 1900 to 2006, and we can again, as she identifies it, the nonviolent civil resistance movement was more efficacious, especially after World War II.
Could I ask a question? Sorry, if we're talking post-World War II, because obviously the world's very different, is there, I'm genuinely asking, I don't know, is there an example in the United States post-World War II of a movement achieving its goals through violence, predominantly?
I think that depends on who you ask. There were elements of the anti-war protests with Vietnam that were decried as violent by hawks and conservatives, but I don't think the movement as a whole would be considered violent.
Wait, why are people saying Stonewall? Was that like...
Did they?
Was that I feel like Stonewall was a pretty big exception in the movement, to be honest.
Yeah.
Are we presupposing success? Because most movements do fail.
True.
Yeah, but that's why I'm asking if like there was any predominantly violent movement in the U.S. that achieved like a particular legislation or like a political goal.
I want Sirius to weigh in on this because I'm pretty sure he quoted Chenoweth directly counter to this.
Yeah, I'm actually looking for that quote as we speak. So
Find it, please.
Regardless, I don't know how important it is that anything be done purely with violence or as like, you know, predominantly
we've been
with
willing,
like,
or even it's just like a part of the strategy.
Right? There are contextual.
Okay. This is
yeah. Go on.
Okay, I have the quote, right? So this is from a 2023 paper by Chenoweth. So this year.
Can you DM it to me too, so I can read?
Yeah, sure.
Right?
We have like even in the abstract, we have suggests that organized armed violence appears to reduce the chances of otherwise nonviolent movements to succeed, whereas unarmed collective violence has more ambiguous effects. So even Chenoweth doesn't have like this absolutist stance that you attribute to her. I sent it in the group chat.
So
like
again,
she reviews multiple
she's not
studies.
saying, and again, she is not saying that in every case violence doesn't work, and in every case nonviolence does work. She absolutely doesn't say that.
Also,
What she's saying is that there is an advantage sometimes, at least some studies.
Do you have a word count, like a page where this quote is?
It's not page.
I've been.
But it's in the abstract. You can look in the abstract.
I have two things to say very quickly. First of all, I do need to dip in the next 10 minutes, Vaush. Thank you very much once again for covering. But secondly, I am woefully ignorant of the Filipino People's Revolution. People Power Revolution, rather. But I'm reading the history of it briefly, and it seems like there were some key assassinations and acts of violence that were critical to the success of that movement as well. I don't think we can really litigate that, but I think it's once again, it is too simplistic to say in any particular case that nonviolence dogmatically, or violence dogmatically for that matter, resulted in the efficacy of any particular movement. Every single one is going to be leaping off the shoulders of some act of violence or some event from before. And in the absence of that, you cannot say, for instance, in the absence of any act of violence that allowed, like nationalistic violence, on the case of Indians long in advance of Gandhi coming out of the scene as a relevant actor, that's going to pave the way for that later movement to be successful. The adjacent attacks on the British by the Indian National Army, that's going to be a critical part of the efficacy of the anti-violent movement. And the critical problem here is that in order to say otherwise, you have to conjecture an alternate universe in which this didn't occur, in which these movements were successful in isolation from these things which were an intrinsic part of the ambience. And one of the weaknesses of a debate format like this is that none of us are going to have an encyclopedic knowledge of any of these cases. But every single one of these cases are going to be hyper-particularized by their environment, which will include the nonviolent action and the violent action that each conditioned the responses by outsiders that made the movements either efficacious or made them sympathetic, etc., or made them alarming enough to even be paid attention to, etc., etc.
So I will read this quote from the abstract, the role of violence and nonviolence resistance, and this was published in 2023. The balance of empirical evidence suggests that organized armed violence appears to reduce the chances for otherwise nonviolent movements to succeed, whereas unarmed collective violence
organized
has more
armed violence is very specific,
effects.
though. Organized armed violence is very
You
specific.
gotta let me finish this, right? I'm giving you the whole quote.
But it's
whereas unarmed collective violence has more ambiguous effects. This is no way suggests that it is beneficial. It's simply more ambiguous than the violent, organized, armed, violent resistance. So
Yeah, but
no, it does
they
not.
literally have, wait,
This
wait,
was
they literally
very
have
much
the article,
dishonestly, I think, framed by
Wick.
you, Sirius.
I'm not
If
trying
you
to
had read this in
dishonestly
the
frame.
Serious Man,
Okay.
I understand you may not be trying to, but it is. It is given this impression that is not substantive, at least by this quote. And
Wait, explain what that quote means. Explain what the quote means.
Sure. It means that whereas we could see a clear distinction where obviously armed, violent, organized militias, groups like that are detrimental to the success of a nonviolent movement. When it comes to non-armed, otherwise violent movements, the data is more mixed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so, in what respect is it mixed, though? Because if you read the full article, she talks about the different studies that have looked at.
I haven't read the article to let you know, so I can't speak on that. But when you say that when I asked for the quote and you gave it to me from the abstract, that's all I can go off of because I don't have time to sit here and read it.
So maybe you don't trust my retelling of the paper, but what I'm saying is that well, never mind then. You can.
No, I don't trust it. That's not a dig on you. That's not a dig on you. I just don't trust anyone to tell me what a paper says. I want to read it myself, right?
I think he means he's skeptical as a baseline.
All right. Well, I mean, this is my reading of the paper, is that if you look at the studies she reviews for that claim, there's a couple things. So first of all, sometimes studies have actually contradictory conclusions. But in other cases, what she reviews is that different studies have different focuses and focus on and have different ideas of what success or failure means, right? So in such a case, you need to weigh the long-term outcomes for yourself. It can't just be, it's not just that they disagree on effective versus not effective in the same respect. They're talking about different respects in which something might be effective. That's why it's ambiguous, is because sometimes for some movement goals, it is effective, and then for others, it's not. So that's what I mean by what I'm doing, which is taking an anti-absolutist approach, where I don't think that we should take violence off the table, even in mostly non-violent movements, because a violent flank can have effects that are beneficial to the overall movement, even if the rest of it is non-violent.
I understand that we can never know the future, but we can know the odds. And again, if you had to bet your life and you had to bet your movement's success on things, we can play the odds here.
But we can't, though. The odds are conditioned by the data, which is conditioned by how we've categorized and identified all these different elements.
Well, that's what I want to know about, is when you talk about the violent flank, is this are we treating the violent flank as if it's part of a strategy? Because again, if we're talking United States in recent history, whether it was both civil rights or BLM, in both cases, you guys were saying earlier that most Americans didn't like MLK.
I like this point.
I like this point. I haven't even started the point.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. But also, that picture of MLK in front of the burning building, be like, I'm going to have a peaceful protest, that was put out by that right-wing propagandist. That opinion on civil rights and MLK fell as groups started to adopt violence more frequently, right? Black Panthers emerged in '66. I think a couple of the old civil rights movements had started to adopt the self-defense doctrine. And at that time, as violence was escalating, even after MLK riots, the approval of those movements started to fall. And with BLM, when the riots started, approval fell. So I feel like in the United States, that
for example,
fringe
you didn't
wing,
have radical regime change
that violent wing doesn't seem to help. It actually does seem to hinder.
Fair enough. But by the same token, it wasn't efficacious in the opposite direction either. If you didn't have radical regime change, there's no reason to think that the civil rights movement wouldn't have been unefficacious for an additional few decades, maybe not more.
If you didn't have radical, can you say that again? Sorry.
Given the conditions under which the Civil Rights Act was actually put into law, there's no reason to think in the absence of that it would not have been an extensively long time. Perhaps Lyndon B. Johnson doesn't win after Kennedy. And the Civil Rights Act is never put into effect.
No, that's I think at that stage, I think even so that is true that nonviolent strategy can only last so long, right? If MLK and the civil rights movement had been ignored for another 20, 30 years, then more people are going to become pro-violence. But I think even that's...
But how do you know what the... Well, I think one of the problems here, though, is that in order to say that nonviolence as a strategy is viable, we're sort of assuming that we have somebody who has a book of references to past protests and is making a calculation and therefore is dictating the activities of a movement. And
but they
then
do.
his dictations. No, they don't.
You're saying this in a hyperbolic sense,
and
but I
his
promise you,
dictations- hang on.
organizations of
And his
movements
dictation-
absolutely look.
No,
towards
we know this isn't the
prior
case, right? Because if we look at how many people talk about like local level politics in America and how these crazy fucking hockey moms have like all the power, and like they're not like, there's no organization of hockey moms saying don't be violent. They just do, they go into fucking like town halls and they lobby congressmen and they get quite a lot of shit done in their favor in their local level.
It absolutely is organized. And
No,
in
but
fact,
like
one of the
Sunny's
one of the
talking about
reasons
like
No, but it's
front,
disseminated.
right? Yeah.
The point though, Whick, is that the movement as a whole, which is characterized by the media as the movement as a whole. By the way, I need to run like in 2 minutes. But the movement as a whole.
I think we should do our closing statements then, and you should take your 2 minutes to do so now.
Damn. Oh, okay. Well, fuck. I hadn't really thought of my closing statement. I guess what we haven't really seen here tonight is any strong argument against the efficacy of violent action in cases where, for example, there isn't a demonstrated advantage in terms of positive media portrayal, general popular sympathy towards the group that is protesting, et cetera, et cetera. We seem to default to sort of a dogmatic assertion that nonviolence has some intrinsic optical advantage, even though an optical advantage relies upon all the mechanisms that produce the optic in the first place. If you're under a situation in which your movement is held in contempt, its constituent members are held in contempt, or the media is corrupt such that it will not accurately portray your actions, your nonviolent actions have zero positive effect as representations of your movement, and therefore there is absolutely no reason to attribute any kind of political advantage to that type of action in the first place. It's not to say that we should valorize a violent action as in some way just more based, quote unquote, than non-violent action, but to take it off the table and to treat any dip into violent action as in some sense intrinsically anti-pragmatic or inefficacious is simply to condition people to cut the legs out from under their own movement if they step out of the bounds of civility politics as defined by a police state which upholds itself by violence. It is once again to prefer the violence of the state arbitrarily, implicitly, for literally no reason other than it has successfully attained a maximal level of violent efficacy, which for some reason you were not willing to allow for any other movement but the state.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Whick.
Your hair is looking lovely today, by the way, Vaush.
Thank you for endearing yourself to the moderator. Whick, go ahead.
Okay, well, I don't know how to respond after that compliment, right? I will say this. It is not enough to say that nonviolence doesn't always work. Obviously, it doesn't always work. What I think I have demonstrated today, through both anecdote, intuition, and through data, is that on the whole, post-World War II, nonviolence gets things done more effectively than violence. We have to look at what happens after the protest, what happens after the change. And again, no change is perfect, no movement is perfect. There's always going to be bad actors, there's always going to be violent actors in a movement, but it's how that movement responds to it that is important. Nonviolence is both morally and effectively superior in most cases. That is not to say all cases. This is not a dogmatic approach. This is me dealing with reality as it is. People prefer stability, rightly or wrongly. That's what most people want. And that's what most people look at when they see you being a destabilizing force and a violent force. Generally, that turns people off of the movement. If you aren't ingratiated yet into the public, the way to ingratiate yourself into the public, which you want to do, is not through violence. You want to ingratiate yourself. Yeah, you want to ingratiate yourself, and nonviolence is the answer, actually.
Thank you. Doe, go right ahead.
Sure. I think to exist as a living thing is to be a force in the world, and to be around other living things means never discounting the possibility that confrontations will intensify. As you can see, our opponents have not shied away at all from their martyrdom beliefs. They do believe that oppressed peoples should wait, get beaten, get abused, get killed, get arrested, as long as it's good for democracy. Efficiency is the name of their game. They don't care about what is right or just. They have almost not at all tried to actually tackle the just question in this debate. They routinely have only talked about, effectiveness at achieving their goals, which to them is some policy change. There are far more goals. Direct action is, of course, the tactic by which you immediately get what you need by, directly. There is no mediation on the scale of the state or anything like that. If you don't want an oil pipeline there, you get rid of it. If you don't want someone to be arrested, you de-arrest them or whatever. This, of course, is not a blanket strategy for every context and every situation. This is just, I just believe that we have to remain allegiant to justice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please, Lonerbox, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I like it when people get things done and make improvements in people's lives. And I think it seems to be the case that in recent history, since World War II, in liberal democracies, the best way to achieve that is either through lobbying legislators or voting or protesting and engaging in civil disobedience, or, prime example, the civil rights movement. And, there will always be people saying you're not violent enough, you're too much of a pussy bitch or whatever. Actually, one person who said that to MLK was Malcolm X. Malcolm X called him a house Negro. He called him an Uncle Tom. End of the day, MLK, the people he was associated with, got the legislation passed, made one of the biggest achievements in African-American history, and Malcolm X just kind of sat on the sidelines complaining that not enough crackers were getting beaten up at the protests. It's literally true. There is a time and place for violence. If you're in Ukraine and your president is literally ordering cops to fire on you, you should rise up. Yeah, of course. In the Weimar Republic, I know Vaush's stream likes to talk about that, a really good opportunity there when democracy had effectively been killed by the Papen coup in 1932. That was like a perfect opportunity for socialists and social democrats and communists, of whom there were plenty, armed, to stand up. They didn't, because the KPD were a bunch of tanky dumb fucks who actually wanted to destroy Weimar democracy along with fucking the Nazis. So there's a time and place for violence. I don't think America in 2023 is necessarily it. If you want to de-arrest a protester, just bear in mind it's like a felony charge. It can get you up to 40 years in jail. I know it's really easy to tell other people to do that, but just take care, all right? Know the risks.
That's a weird slight. Very weird slight.
It's not weird.
All right.
It's direct.
Thank you. Sirius, please.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have that much more to add. I think that we should always be open to any given tactic at any given time. We shouldn't preclude ourselves from violence just because, some people find it a little bit icky. I agree with, I'm pretty sympathetic, maybe more so even than President Sunday and Doe, to talks of efficiency and that kind of stuff. But it's not always going to be the case that nonviolence is the best strategy, and we should never take something off the table categorically. That's all I'm advocating for, is that we should not categorically take violence off the table, and that even when there is nonviolent protest, it's not an all or nothing deal. It's not the case that an overall nonviolent movement is always can't benefit from having violent elements in some cases. That's all.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Meat, go ahead.
There's been, as far as I can see it, there's been a lot of conflation of terms, a lot of ambiguating of terms here. I guess I'll just say, whether it's the word violence or the word protest, if we're talking about violent versus nonviolent protesting, protesting is ingratiation. You're trying to get people on your side, you're trying to get your message out there, you're trying to get people to agree with you, you're trying to get people to want to pass a certain policy, for a certain leader to resign. It's some form of ingratiation. If you're saying that you're trying to do a revolution, well, that's not a protest. There may be protesting happening at the same time, but the revolution itself is not protest. If you're saying that there's an authoritarian regime that is literally forcefully preventing you, literally, authoritatively, forcefully preventing you from protesting, well, forcefully allowing yourself to protest is different than protesting. Like, these actually happen on the same side. I know it might seem like I'm being nitpicky, but fundamentally these are technically different things. And in the case of protesting, in the case of ingratiation, listen, I'm not fundamentally against violence as some axiom either. I actually think I'm probably more comfortable in theory morally with the idea of violence, probably with the other people on my team over here. But the thing is that we're talking about categorically versus non-categorically excluding things. The problem is that when it comes to a society that are not fitting these authoritative prerequisites, where force in the ways that me and Whick and Lonerbox would use the term, not in the most ambiguated way, when literal force and if you're existing within an actual authoritative regime, then if you're existing outside of those bounds, then you are sort of putting yourself outside the category of violence being effective in protest. Because the great thing about societies that are not authoritarian regimes, are that they're sort of based upon the more liberal ideals that all societies tend towards over time, which is cooperation.
Okay. And for my part, my opinion is that all violence is bad all the time. I'm not a threat to the United States or her interests. And my only moral position at all is that crimes are wrong.
Before you go, my chat is dying to know, how's the cat?
He's doing wonderfully. Perfectly healthy.
Hell yeah.
Hey, thank you for the mostly peaceful debate tonight.
I thank you all very much for...
My people are moving into position as we speak.
For coming out. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Have a good night.
You
Thanks.
too.
Thanks, Vaush. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Everyone have a good one. Take care.
Cheerio.
Bye.
Okay, guys. I need to... Where's the jab at Vaush? Why would I jab at Vaush? Vaush was nice enough. Oh god, I don't know what the fuck. Whick was going his own way. Holy shit.